Tonight, we follow the long and winding history of a single tribe, born from violence, shaped by survival, and carried across generations of ruin. This is the story of the Great Khans. From their earliest days among the scattered survivors of the old world, through cycles of loss, revenge, and fragile hope, their path mirrors the harsh rhythms of the post-war world itself. There is no rush here. Only time, memory, and the slow unfolding of a people searching for a future beyond endless conflict. Rest now as the journey begins. When the world ended, it did not do so cleanly or evenly. The Great War erased cities in moments, but what followed was slower, quieter, and far more enduring. In the decades after the bombs fell, the land that had once been California became a broken expanse of ash, cracked highways, and scattered survivors. Civilization did not disappear all at once. It fractured. Communities formed where they could, held together by necessity, fear, and memory. Others never stabilized at all, drifting instead into violence as their primary means of survival. Among these early post-war groups were the raiders. They were not born as monsters, nor did they initially see themselves as villains. Many were refugees who had lost shelter, family, and any sense of long-term safety. Without stable food supplies, functioning governments, or shared laws, survival became immediate and personal. Strength, intimidation, and aggression were the most reliable currencies left. Over time, groups that relied on these traits hardened into identities built around them. In the earliest years after the war, raider bands were loosely organized. They gathered around strong individuals, people capable of violence without hesitation, people who could lead others through fear or loyalty. These groups scavenged ruins, ambushed travelers, and fought rival bands over territory that offered even the smallest advantage. A functioning well, a defensible hill, or an intact road could mean the difference between survival and extinction. There was little room for mercy. Weakness was punished quickly, either by outsiders or from within. As years passed, these raider bands began to develop traditions. What started as practical brutality became ritualized behavior. Stories were told around campfires about successful raids and fallen leaders. Symbols, clothing styles, and shared language began to emerge. Children born into these groups did not remember the old world. For them, violence was not a collapse of society. It was society. Loyalty to the group mattered more than any abstract idea of morality, and enemies were defined not by ideology, but by proximity and threat. In this environment, bloodlines mattered less than survival instincts. People joined raider groups because there was nowhere else to go. Settlements existed, but they were rare, fragile, and often hostile to outsiders. To approach a town without weapons or proof of usefulness was to risk death. Raiders, at least, offered a form of belonging. Protection was conditional, but it was real. Food was shared, as long as you contributed. The world had narrowed to simple rules. Drugs became part of this early raider culture as well. Chems offered escape from hunger, fear, and memory. They dulled pain and sharpened aggression. In a world where tomorrow was uncertain, the cost of addiction felt distant and abstract. Chems were traded, stolen, and consumed without restraint, weaving themselves into daily life. Over time, they became both a tool and a chain, reinforcing cycles of violence and dependency. Not all raider groups were the same. Some were nomadic, striking quickly and disappearing into the wastes. Others settled into semi-permanent camps, defending specific territories with ruthless efficiency. Alliances formed and collapsed just as quickly. There were no lasting treaties, only temporary arrangements shaped by convenience. Betrayal was common, expected even. Trust extended only as far as immediate benefit. The land itself shaped these groups. The ruins of cities offered cover and salvage. but were dangerous, filled with radiation, unstable structures, and mutated creatures. Open deserts allowed visibility but left raiders exposed to retaliation. Each region produced its own kind of survivor, adapted to the dangers of the terrain. Over time, this produced distinct cultures, even among groups that shared similar origins. It was within this fragmented, violent landscape that the earliest ancestors of the Khans emerged. They were not yet a named tribe, nor did they see themselves as part of any grand lineage. They were one group among many, shaped by the same pressures as their rivals. Their identity was fluid, their future uncertain. What set them apart was not ideology or ambition, but endurance. They survived where others faded, absorbing losses and continuing forward. Memory, even in these early years, played a quiet role. Stories of betrayal, of massacres, of lost camps were passed down informally. These stories carried lessons, warnings, and grudges. Even before the Khans had a name, the seeds of generational memory were being planted. Survival was not just about staying alive. It was about remembering who had harmed you and why. As the decades continued, the wastes began to shift again. Small settlements grew larger, trade routes formed. New ideas about order and governance began to take shape. For raider groups, this change was threatening. Stability elsewhere meant pressure on their way of life. Borders hardened. Patrols increased. Violence that had once gone unanswered now brought retaliation. The raider groups that would one day become the Khans did not adapt by abandoning violence. Instead, they refined it. They learned which targets were worth the risk and which were not. They learned when to retreat and when to strike decisively. Leadership became more structured, with authority earned through reputation rather than brute force alone. Survival demanded learning, even within chaos. By the time the wider world began to recognize emerging factions and proto-states, these raider ancestors were already veterans of hardship. They carried scars from countless conflicts, losses that had never been recorded, and victories that existed only in memory. They had no written history, no monuments, no preserved relics of the old world. What they had was continuity. This continuity would soon be tested. Larger forces were beginning to rise, forces that believed in rebuilding rather than enduring. When these worlds collided, the consequences would shape the Khans for generations to come. But for now, in these early years, they remained what the wasteland had made them. Survivors first, raiders second. A people not yet named, moving through the ashes of a world that no longer remembered what it had been. Vault 15 was never meant to produce unity. Even before the Great War reshaped the surface, it had been designed as a social experiment built on contradiction. Its inhabitants were selected from vastly different ideological, cultural, and political backgrounds, all sealed together beneath the earth with the expectation that time and pressure would reveal what happened when incompatible beliefs were forced to coexist. For a while, the vault functioned, systems ran, supplies were distributed, life continued in a controlled, artificial balance. But beneath the routines, tension waited. As years passed underground, the differences between residents did not soften, they sharpened. Conflicting views on authority, cooperation, and survival created invisible fault lines within the population. Small disagreements became persistent divisions. Conversations turned cautious. Trust eroded slowly, almost imperceptibly. The Vault's technology kept bodies alive, but it could not resolve the deeper fractures forming between people who shared no common vision of the future. When the Vault finally opened, it did not release a unified community into the wasteland. It released fragments. The surface world they emerged into was harsh, irradiated, and unforgiving. The promise of the Vault had been safety, but safety ended the moment the doors opened. The residents of Vault 15 were suddenly exposed to scarcity, violence, and uncertainty. Old disagreements, once theoretical, became immediate and dangerous. Some groups attempted cooperation at first. They shared resources, scouted nearby ruins, and searched for land that could support permanent settlement. But trust, already weakened by years underground, collapsed under the strain of survival. Decisions about leadership, defense, and distribution of food became flashpoints. Every mistake carried consequences, and blame followed quickly. It did not take long for separation to feel inevitable. The former residents of Vault 15 split into distinct factions, each carrying their own interpretation of how survival should be achieved. One group would go on to help found what became Shady Sands, built on cooperation, structure, and long-term rebuilding. Others drifted away, unwilling or unable to conform to rules that demanded restraint and shared responsibility. Among those who left were individuals who would form the earliest ancestors of the Khans. They did not leave with a clear plan or shared ideology. What united them was disillusionment. The promise of peaceful rebuilding felt fragile, slow, and vulnerable. In a world filled with threats, patience seemed like a luxury they could not afford. They chose movement over settlement, strength over compromise. The wasteland rewarded this choice in the short term. Mobility allowed them to avoid larger threats and exploit weaker targets. They learned to survive without fixed infrastructure, adapting quickly to changing conditions. Camps were temporary. Alliances were conditional. Loyalty was earned through action, not words. This way of life felt honest in a world that offered no guarantees. Yet separation came at a cost. Without the protection of walls or organized defense, danger was constant. Mutated creatures, rival groups, and environmental hazards tested them daily. Loss became familiar. Death was not a distant possibility, but a regular occurrence. These experiences reinforced their belief that the world could not be trusted, only endured. Over time, identity began to form around this shared hardship. The people who left Vault 15 together began to see themselves as distinct, not just from the settlements they had abandoned, but from other raider bands as well. Their origin gave them a sense of shared history, however fractured. They remembered the Vault not as a home, but as a place where unity failed. That memory shaped their outlook on cooperation for generations. Children born after the exodus from Vault 15 inherited these stories secondhand. They learned that confinement bred weakness, that rules invited betrayal, and that survival depended on readiness for violence. The Vault became a cautionary tale rather than a refuge. Its sealed corridors and artificial order represented vulnerability, not safety. As the broader wasteland evolved, the fragments from Vault 15 moved along diverging paths. Shady Sands grew slowly, laying foundations for what would become the new California Republic. Other groups scattered into obscurity, absorbed by larger factions or erased by time. The ancestors of the Khans remained visible, not because they built monuments, but because they refused to disappear. Their encounters with settlements were tense and often violent. Trade was rare. Negotiation was seen as weakness. Each interaction reinforced the belief that the world was divided between those who took and those who lost. The lessons learned underground echoed outward, shaping decisions long after the Vault itself had faded into legend. Vault 15's true legacy was not found in technology or architecture, but in division. It created multiple futures from a single beginning, each shaped by how its people responded to conflict. For the group that would one day be known as the Khans, that response was to reject fragile systems and embrace a harsher reality. They did not yet have a name, they were not yet a tribe in the formal sense, but the fracture that defined them had already occurred. Their path away from Vault 15 marked the beginning of a long journey, one guided less by hope and more by caution, memory, and survival. The vault doors had closed behind them, but the consequences of what happened inside would follow them across the wasteland for generations. In the years following their departure from Vault 15, the people who would become the first Khans began to harden into something distinct. The wasteland did not allow neutrality for long. Survival demanded decisions, and decisions carried consequences that shaped identity. What had once been a loose gathering of disillusioned survivors slowly transformed into a group defined by shared habits, shared dangers, and shared enemies. At first, there was no formal structure. Leadership shifted depending on circumstance. Those who could fight led during conflict. Those who knew the land guided movement. Authority was practical, not ceremonial. Respect was earned through action and maintained only as long as it remained useful. In a world without permanence, even leadership was temporary. Their camps were modest and mobile. They avoided settling too long in one place, aware that fixed locations attracted attention. Fires were kept small, supplies were divided quickly. What could not be carried was abandoned without sentiment. This transience reinforced a sense that nothing was meant to last, and that attachment was dangerous. Violence became both tool and language. Encounters with other groups rarely began peacefully, not because peace was impossible, but because hesitation could be fatal. The wasteland rewarded those who struck first and decisively. Over time, this approach became instinct. Negotiation faded as an option, replaced by displays of strength meant to deter retaliation. Raiding emerged not as an ideology, but as an economy. Scavenging ruins provided scraps, but ambushing travelers or weaker settlements offered more reliable returns. Food, weapons, chems, and information could all be taken by force. Each successful raid reinforced the belief that survival depended on domination rather than cooperation. As raids continued, patterns formed, targets were chosen carefully, routes were memorized, scouts learned to read signs in the dust and sky, ambushes were planned with increasing sophistication. What began as desperation evolved into strategy. Violence was no longer chaotic, it was purposeful. With repetition came ritual. Before raids, weapons were checked in silence. Afterward, spoils were divided according to unspoken rules. Those injured were tended to if resources allowed. Those who failed were not mourned publicly. Grief was private, subdued, and quickly buried beneath necessity. Symbols began to appear, though they were informal at first. Certain markings on clothing or armor distinguished members from outsiders. These were not yet banners or sigils, but they served a purpose. They created recognition. They reinforced belonging. To wear them was to declare allegiance to a group that promised protection, however brutal its methods. Children raised within these camps learned quickly. There were no formal lessons, but observation served as education. They learned how to handle weapons before they could fully understand their weight. They learned to stay quiet when danger approached and to move without hesitation when ordered. Fear was present, but it was normalized. It became part of daily life rather than an exception. Stories were told in the evenings, not to inspire hope, but to reinforce caution. Tales of ambushes gone wrong, of settlements that trusted strangers, of leaders who hesitated at the wrong moment. These stories were warnings disguised as history. They shaped behavior more effectively than rules ever could. Chems continued to play a central role. They were consumed to dull pain, traded for supplies, and used to push bodies beyond natural limits during combat. Dependency grew quietly, few questioned it. In a world without medical care or long-term planning, the future cost of addiction seemed irrelevant. Survival today mattered more than health tomorrow. As the group grew more confident, encounters with other raider bands increased. These meetings were volatile. Sometimes they resulted in temporary alliances, usually short-lived. More often, they ended in bloodshed. Territory was contested, claimed, and lost repeatedly. Each conflict refined their approach and hardened their resolve. Over time, reputation spread. Travelers learned to avoid certain routes. Settlements whispered warnings. The group became known not for cruelty alone, but for persistence. They did not vanish after setbacks. They regrouped, they returned. Losses were absorbed, not allowed to fracture the whole. This persistence marked an early distinction. Many raider bands burned brightly and disappeared just as quickly, undone by internal conflict or external pressure. They learned from failure, even when learning meant embracing harsher methods. Despite their growing identity, they still lacked a name that endured. They were referred to by others through insults, fear, or location. Internally, identity was less about labels and more about shared experience. They knew who belonged and who did not. That was enough. The world around them continued to change. Settlements expanded. Trade routes became more guarded. Organized defense began to emerge. These developments did not go unnoticed. They were watched with suspicion and resentment. Yet beneath the aggression, a deeper current was forming. Memory began to stretch beyond individual lifetimes. Stories were no longer only about recent raids, but about the past. About Vault 15, about the choice to leave. These memories became touchstones, shaping decisions even when the original events were distant. By the time the wider wasteland began to recognize emerging powers, the first Khans were already something more than survivors. They were a group with habits, traditions, and an unspoken code shaped by years of conflict. They were not yet legendary. They were not yet infamous. But their foundation had been laid. They had chosen a path defined by strength and endurance, one that rejected fragile systems in favor of immediate control. It was a path that would bring them into direct conflict with the forces of rebuilding and order. The consequences of that choice would echo far beyond these early years, shaping their fate in ways they could not yet foresee. As the years passed, the wasteland around the former residence of Vault 15 began to settle into fragile patterns. One of these patterns took shape in a small community that would later be known as Shady Sands. Built by those who chose cooperation over constant movement, it stood in quiet contrast to the roaming groups that surrounded it. Where others relied on intimidation and force, Shady Sands relied on walls, shared labor, and the slow construction of trust. At first, contact between the emerging settlement and the raider descendants of Vault 15 was limited and uncertain. Distance provided a measure of safety for both sides, but the wasteland was shrinking. Trade routes crossed old roads, water sources drew travelers together, and survival often forced interaction where none was desired. Eventually, paths intersected. Early encounters were cautious. Small groups approached each other with weapons visible but lowered. Words were exchanged sparingly. Supplies were sometimes traded, sometimes stolen. Neither side fully understood the other, and neither trusted the intentions behind unfamiliar customs. The settlers of Shady Sands viewed the raiders as unpredictable and dangerous. The raiders saw the settlement as fragile, wealthy, and naive. Shady Sands represented something the raiders had deliberately rejected. It was permanent. It invested time and effort into building structures that could not be moved. It depended on cooperation and restraint, traits the raiders associated with failure and betrayal. To them, the settlement was a gamble against a world that had already proven itself unforgiving. From the settlers' perspective, the raiders embodied chaos. They threatened stability, disrupted trade, and undermined efforts to build something lasting. Fear traveled quickly through Shady Sands whenever raider activity was reported nearby. Patrols were organized, defensive measures increased. What began as concern hardened into suspicion. Tensions grew as encounters became more frequent. Raiders scouted the outskirts of the settlement, observing routines and defenses. They noted guard shifts, water access points, and supply storage. This was not yet preparation for open attack, but it planted the idea that Shady Sands was vulnerable. The very openness that allowed the settlement to function also exposed its weaknesses. At the same time, the raiders' presence forced Shady Sands to evolve. Walls were reinforced. Watchtowers were built. Leadership structures became more formal. Decisions were debated, recorded, and remembered. Ideological differences deepened the divide. Shady Sands believed that survival depended on rebuilding society, recreating law, and extending trust cautiously but deliberately. The raiders believed that trust was a liability and that the world rewarded those who seized advantage without hesitation. These beliefs were not abstract, they shaped every interaction. Misunderstandings escalated quickly. A stolen supply cache led to accusations. A missing caravan sparked retaliation. Each incident reinforced existing assumptions. To the settlers, every raid confirmed the danger raiders posed. To the raiders, every defensive response confirmed that settlements would always view them as enemies. The shared origin of both groups in Vault 15 was largely forgotten or ignored. The vault that once held them together now served as a silent witness to their divergence. Its legacy lingered only in fragmented memory, overshadowed by present conflict. What might have been a point of connection became irrelevant in the face of daily survival. As Shady Sands grew more confident, it began to assert control over nearby land. Farming expanded, roads were cleared, patrols extended further into surrounding territory. For the raiders, this expansion felt invasive. Land that had once been open now carried boundaries enforced by armed settlers. Freedom of movement narrowed. This pressure pushed the raiders into more aggressive behavior. Raids became bolder, warnings were ignored. The line between opportunistic survival and targeted hostility blurred. Each side believed it was responding to the other's aggression, caught in a cycle where cause and effect were impossible to separate. For the raiders, Shady Sands became more than a settlement. It became a symbol of a future they did not trust. A future that demanded rules, compromise, and patience. To allow such a place to thrive nearby felt like an existential threat, not just to resources, but to identity. Within Shady Sands, the raiders became a cautionary tale. Parents warned children about the dangers beyond the walls. Guards trained with the expectation of eventual conflict. The presence of raiders shaped the settlement's early character, embedding vigilance and preparedness into its culture. These early interactions did not immediately explode into open war, but they laid the groundwork for what would follow. Suspicion hardened into resentment. Resentment turned into fear. Fear demanded action. The distance between raiders and settlers narrowed, not physically, but psychologically. In the quiet years before open violence, the future of both groups was already being decided. One moved towards structure and governance. The other clung to mobility and force. Both believed their path was the only viable one in a broken world. When their beliefs finally collided, the outcome would leave scars that endured far beyond the moment of impact. The fragile tension between the raiders descended from Vault 15 and the growing settlement of Shady Sands did not break all at once. It tightened gradually, pulled thinner by fear, misunderstanding, and the steady pressure of proximity. For a time, violence remained scattered and indirect. Raids happened along roads rather than at walls. Retaliation was measured, not decisive. Both sides still believed the conflict could remain contained. That belief ended with a single act that shifted perception on both sides. During one of the Khan's raids, a young woman named Tandi was taken captive. She was not a random traveler. She was the daughter of Aradesh, the leader of Shady Sands. Her capture was not initially intended as an act of symbolic war. It was an extension of established raider behavior, the taking of leverage, resources, and people in a world where such acts had become common. Yet this time, the consequences were different. For Shady Sands, Tandi's abduction was not merely a loss, it was a direct challenge to the settlement's authority and safety. The walls, patrols, and precautions that defined their identity had failed in a moment that mattered deeply. The idea that cooperation and restraint could ensure survival suddenly felt insufficient. The raiders, for their part, underestimated the response. To them, the kidnapping was consistent with the logic of the wasteland. Power was asserted through action. Hostages were tools. The emotional weight carried by the act was not fully understood, or perhaps not considered relevant. They had taken from many before. The situation drew in an outsider, the Vault Dweller. Emerging from Vault 13, the Vault Dweller was already navigating the dangers of the wasteland, learning its unspoken rules and shifting power structures. The abduction of Tandi became a focal point, not only because of her identity, but because it represented the widening gap between two ways of life. The Vault Dweller's involvement transformed a local conflict into a defining moment. When the Vault Dweller approached the Khan's camp, diplomacy was fragile at best. Words were exchanged under the shadow of drawn weapons. The possibility of negotiation existed briefly, balanced against long-standing suspicion. The Khans were willing to trade. They were accustomed to extracting value from hostages. This was not unusual to them. But the presence of the Vault Dweller introduced unpredictability. Unlike caravans or settlements, the Vault Dweller was not bound by established expectation. Armed, capable, and driven by objectives that extended beyond local politics, the Vault Dweller represented a new kind of force in the wasteland. What followed unfolded quickly and decisively. The Khan's camp, which had served as a temporary stronghold, was attacked. Leadership was targeted. Fighters were cut down. Defenses that had sufficed against other raiders proved inadequate against a determined and well-equipped adversary. The violence was not prolonged, it was efficient. When it ended, the Khan's settlement was destroyed. Those who survived fled into the wastes, scattered and disoriented. The campfires that had once marked their presence burned out, leaving behind silence and ruins. Tandi was freed, returned to Shady Sands alive. For the settlers, the outcome was clear. Justice had been served, a threat had been eliminated, safety had been restored. For the Khans, the event was remembered differently. What they experienced was not a defeat in battle, but near annihilation. Their community, already shaped by hardship, had been erased in a single violent response. Fighters, elders, and non-combatants alike were lost. The scale of destruction exceeded anything they had previously faced. This was not a skirmish, it was a massacre. In the aftermath, survivors carried the weight of the loss with them as they moved through the wasteland. There was no time to mourn openly. Survival demanded movement, but memory persisted. Faces, names, and moments replayed in quiet reflection. The destruction of the camp became a defining wound, one that reshaped their understanding of the world. Shady Sands moved forward. The settlement grew. Its leadership gained confidence. The lesson they took from the event was that decisive action could secure their future. The idea that threats could be eliminated through force became part of their evolving doctrine. Over time, this belief would expand into something larger, shaping the foundations of what would become the new California Republic. The Khans took a different lesson. They learned that settlements did not simply defend themselves, they destroyed those who challenged them. Trust, in any form, was reclassified as fatal weakness. The idea that negotiation could offer safety was abandoned. In its place grew a belief that survival required constant readiness for overwhelming retaliation. The memory of the Vault Dweller became intertwined with the memory of Shady Sands. The distinction between individual and settlement blurred. Blame settled not on a single figure, but on an entire way of life that prioritized rebuilding over endurance. The Khan's anger was not random, it was focused and generational. Children born after the massacre grew up hearing stories of what had been lost. The destroyed camp became a place spoken of but never visited, its exact location fading into uncertainty. The narrative hardened with each retelling. Details sharpened where they served the story, softened where they did not. What remained consistent was the sense of betrayal and injustice. The Khans did not disappear after this event. They were reduced, fractured, and forced into retreat, but they endured. Survivors found each other over time, drawn together by shared loss. In the absence of physical structures, memory became the foundation of identity. The massacre also altered how the Khans interacted with the wider wasteland. Caution gave way to hostility. Where they once avoided certain conflicts, they now embraced confrontation as inevitable. If destruction could come without warning, then restraint no longer served a purpose. This moment marked the end of the Khan's earliest chapter. What had begun as a group of survivors from Vault 15 had been violently reshaped. Their identity was no longer just about endurance or raiding, it was about remembrance. From this point forward, the Khans carried a single, unifying story. They had been wronged, they had been nearly erased, and they would not forget. The wasteland absorbed the echoes of the violence and moved on, as it always did. New conflicts emerged, new settlements rose. But for the Khans, time narrowed around this moment. The destruction of their camp became the axis around which future decisions would turn. It was the first great loss in a history defined by loss, and it ensured that reconciliation with the world of settlements would never come easily, if it came at all. In the years that followed the destruction of their camp, the survivors of the Khans carried more than physical scars. They carried memory, shaped by fear and sharpened by grief. With no fixed home and no written record, remembrance became the only structure they could rely on. It traveled with them across the wasteland, woven into conversation, behavior, and silence. Loss was not processed openly. There were no ceremonies, no graves marked with names. The world did not allow for such pauses. Movement was survival. Camps were temporary, dismantled before dawn. Yet the absence of mourning did not mean the absence of pain. Grief settled quietly, becoming part of daily existence rather than an event to be resolved. Stories of the massacre were told repeatedly, though never in the same way. Details shifted with each telling. Some accounts emphasized betrayal, others focused on the overwhelming force used against them. Over time, these stories stopped being about individuals and became about identity. The camp was no longer just a place. It was a symbol of what happened when the Khans were vulnerable. Children born after the massacre inherited these stories as lessons. They learned early that settlements could not be trusted, no matter how peaceful they appeared. Shady Sands became a name spoken with caution and resentment. It represented more than a location. It embodied the idea that cooperation invited destruction. As the survivors regrouped, memory became a unifying force. They were no longer simply people who traveled together. They were people who had endured the same loss. This shared trauma created bonds stronger than convenience. Loyalty deepened, reinforced by the belief that the world beyond their group was inherently hostile. This belief shaped behavior in subtle ways. Encounters with outsiders became colder. Words were measured carefully. Weapons were never far from reach. Even neutral interactions were framed through the lens of past violence. The massacre lingered beneath every decision, influencing choices long after the immediate danger had passed. The Khan's understanding of justice shifted as well. The idea of balance or fairness lost relevance. What mattered was survival and retaliation. The memory of overwhelming force used against them justified their own future actions. If destruction had been delivered without mercy, then mercy no longer seemed necessary. Leadership during this period was influenced heavily by memory. Those who spoke most vividly about the past gained authority. Elders who had survived the massacre were listened to with reverence. Their words carried weight not because of strategy or vision, but because they had witnessed the loss firsthand. Their pain granted legitimacy. This dynamic reinforced a cycle. The more the massacre was remembered, the more it shaped the present. The past was not something to move beyond, but something to hold on to. Letting go felt dangerous, even disloyal. Forgetting was equated with vulnerability. Over time, this fixation narrowed their options. Adaptation became difficult when every change was measured against old wounds. Cooperation with settlements felt impossible. Negotiation seemed naive. The world was divided into two categories: those who belonged and those who threatened. Despite this, the Khans did not collapse inward completely. They continued to survive, to raid, to move. Daily life required focus on the present. Food had to be found. Shelter had to be secured. Children had to be protected. Yet, beneath these immediate concerns, the memory of loss remained constant. The wasteland offered no external acknowledgement of what had happened. There were no trials, no apologies, no recognition of wrongdoing. Shady Sands continued to grow. The vault dwellers' actions became legend elsewhere, framed as heroism rather than destruction. This absence of validation deepened the Khans' sense of injustice. Isolation followed naturally. The Khans withdrew further from emerging trade networks and settlements. They relied on their own systems, however limited. This isolation reinforced their narrative, creating an echo chamber where memory went unchallenged and resentment intensified. Chems played a role in dulling the emotional weight of this period. They softened the edges of grief, offering temporary escape, but they also prevented healing. Pain was numbed rather than addressed, preserved beneath layers of dependency and distraction. As years passed, the massacre transformed from a lived experience into a foundational myth. New generations accepted it as an unquestionable truth. The nuances of what had happened faded. What remained was a simplified story of victimhood and betrayal. Complexity was lost, replaced by certainty. This certainty provided direction. It told the Khans who they were and who they were not. It justified aggression and resistance. It explained why the world felt hostile. In a landscape defined by uncertainty, this clarity was comforting, even if it was rooted in pain. The trauma did not destroy the Khans, but it confined them. Their identity hardened around loss, limiting their ability to imagine alternative futures. Survival continued, but growth stalled. The past loomed larger than the present. In carrying this memory forward, the Khans ensured that the massacre would never truly end. It lived on in stories, decisions, and fears, shaping generations who had never seen the destroyed camp for themselves. The wasteland moved forward, indifferent to their grief, but the Khans remained anchored to that moment. This period did not bring resolution or healing. It marked the beginning of a long struggle between remembrance and survival, a struggle that would define the Khans' path for decades to come. Survival after near extinction required more than endurance. It required change, even if that change came slowly and reluctantly. In the years following the massacre, the scattered survivors of the Khans began to find one another again. These reunions were not planned. They happened through rumor, shared signs, and chance encounters along familiar routes. Recognition came through scars, through remembered names, through stories that only those who had been there could know. As numbers grew, so did the need for structure. The loose organization that had once defined their way of life was no longer sufficient. Too much had been lost to allow chaos to persist unchecked. Leadership began to consolidate, guided not only by strength, but by memory. Those who carried the clearest recollections of the past were entrusted with shaping the future. This period marked the emergence of what came to be known as the New Khans. The name was not chosen lightly. It reflected both continuity and defiance. They were the same people who had survived the massacre, but they were no longer willing to exist as a nameless group of raiders drifting through the wastes. Naming themselves was an act of reclamation. It declared survival as identity. The New Khans did not abandon raiding, but they refined it. Raids became more selective, driven by necessity rather than impulse. Reckless violence was discouraged, not out of mercy, but because it attracted retaliation. Experience had taught them the cost of drawing too much attention. Survival now depended on remaining dangerous without becoming a target for annihilation. Camps were organized with greater care. Lookouts were posted. Escape routes were planned in advance. Supplies were hidden rather than stored openly. These practices reflected a growing awareness of vulnerability. The memory of their destroyed camp lingered, shaping every decision. Nothing was allowed to become permanent enough to be lost again. Cultural practices also began to solidify. Stories of the past were formalized, repeated with intention rather than casually shared. Elders ensured that younger members learned not only what had happened, but how to interpret it. The narrative emphasized resilience and warning. Trust was framed as conditional. Strength was framed as necessity. Despite this, internal divisions remained. Not all members agreed on the direction the New Khans were taking. Some argued for continued aggression, believing that only overwhelming force could prevent future massacres. Others favored caution, advocating for distance and discretion. These debates rarely surfaced openly, but they influenced decisions quietly. Chems continued to be part of daily life, though their role shifted. Rather than simple escape, they became tools for trade and leverage. The New Khans recognized their value in a wasteland where addiction was widespread. This provided resources, but it also reinforced dependency within the group. The long-term consequences were ignored in favor of immediate benefit. As the New Khans stabilized, their reputation returned. Settlements remembered them not as victims, but as persistent threats. Fear resurfaced along old routes. Caravans altered paths. Warnings spread quietly. The New Khans were no longer numerous, but they were known. In the wasteland, reputation mattered as much as strength. This renewed presence brought them back into indirect contact with Shady Sands. Though they avoided direct confrontation, the shadow of past conflict loomed. Each patrol, each expansion of farmland, was monitored with suspicion. The New Khans measured their movements carefully, aware that another misstep could bring destruction once more. The rise of Shady Sands into a larger political entity deepened this tension. As the settlement grew in power and influence, it represented everything the New Khans feared. Order was expanding. Borders were hardening. The world was becoming less forgiving of those who lived outside its rules. For the New Khans, this shift felt like history repeating itself. The same pressures that had led to the massacre were emerging again, only on a larger scale. This reinforced the belief that coexistence was impossible. Survival required resistance, even if that resistance was quiet. Children born into the New Khans during this period inherited a more defined identity than previous generations. They were taught who they were and why they mattered. The name carried weight. It connected them to a past marked by loss and endurance. It offered belonging in a world that offered little else. Yet this identity also imposed limits. By defining themselves primarily through survival and grievance, the New Khans restricted their ability to imagine alternative futures. Progress was measured not by growth, but by continued existence. Change was viewed with suspicion, especially when it resembled the structures that had once destroyed them. Still, the act of reformation mattered. It ensured continuity. It prevented dissolution. The New Khans endured where many others faded into obscurity. They adapted without forgiving. They remembered without healing. This balance allowed them to persist, But it came at a cost. The wasteland continued to evolve around them. New factions emerged. Old conflicts shifted. The new Khans remained on the margins, watching and waiting. Their survival was no longer accidental. It was deliberate, shaped by lessons learned through loss. This chapter did not mark triumph or recovery. It marked consolidation. The new Khans had reformed, but they were not free of the past. They carried it with them, shaping every decision, every alliance avoided, every threat anticipated. In choosing to endure without reconciliation, they secured their existence, but they also set the stage for future conflict. The new Khans were no longer simply survivors of a massacre. They were a people defined by it, moving forward while looking backward, their path shaped by memory as much as by necessity. As the new Khans rebuilt themselves in the shadow of past destruction, the world beyond their camps was undergoing a transformation of its own. Shady Sands was no longer a solitary settlement surrounded by uncertainty. It was becoming something larger, more ambitious, and far more organized. What had once been an experiment in cooperation was steadily evolving into a political force that would reshape the balance of power across the region. The new California Republic did not emerge overnight. Its rise was gradual, marked by legislation, patrols, and expanding influence rather than sudden conquest. Farms multiplied, trade routes stabilized, agreements were written and enforced. The language of law began to replace the language of survival. For many wastelanders, this shift offered safety and predictability in a world that had long lacked both. For the new Khans, it felt like a tightening grip. Each expansion of the Republic narrowed the spaces where raiders could move freely. Roads that had once been open became guarded. Water sources were claimed and regulated. Areas that had offered temporary refuge were absorbed into a growing network of settlements and patrols. The wasteland was no longer a patchwork of isolated groups. It was becoming a territory with borders. The Republic framed its growth as protection. Patrols were established to defend caravans from raiders and mutated creatures. Taxes were collected to fund infrastructure. Disputes were settled through courts rather than violence. To its citizens, these measures represented progress. To those outside its protection, they represented control. The new Khans found themselves increasingly defined as outsiders. Their reputation, shaped by years of raiding and resistance, preceded them wherever they went. Encounters with NCR forces were tense and often hostile. Warnings were issued, demands were made, compliance was expected. There was little room for negotiation. These interactions reinforced old fears. The Republic was not simply rebuilding civilization, it was imposing it. The new Khans saw, in its expansion, the same forces that had once destroyed their camp, now amplified and legitimized by law. Where the Vault Dweller had acted as an individual, the NCR acted as an institution, backed by numbers, resources, and authority. As NCR territory expanded, the Khans were pushed into harsher environments. Fertile land became scarce, safe routes disappeared. Survival grew more difficult, not because the wasteland was more dangerous, but because it was more organized. The Republic's success limited alternatives. Skirmishes became more common along contested borders. Patrols clashed with raider scouts. Retaliation followed swiftly. Unlike earlier conflicts with settlements, these encounters carried lasting consequences. The NCR recorded incidents, tracked movements, and responded systematically. Violence no longer faded into obscurity. It was remembered and addressed. This systematic response was unsettling. The new Khans were accustomed to a world where actions vanished into dust and rumor. Now, consequences accumulated. Each confrontation added to a growing ledger of hostility. The Republic did not forget, it documented. Within the new Khans, debate intensified. Some saw the NCR as an enemy that had to be resisted openly, believing that submission would lead to erasure. Others argued that direct confrontation was unsustainable. The Republic's numbers and resources dwarfed their own. Survival, they reasoned, required avoidance rather than defiance. These disagreements rarely erupted into open conflict, but they influenced behavior. Raids were scaled back near NCR territory. Movement became cautious. Information about patrol routes and schedules was gathered obsessively. The new Khans adapted, but adaptation felt like retreat. The rise of the NCR also altered the perception of legitimacy in the wasteland. Settlements outside its borders began to emulate its structures, seeking recognition or protection. Law and order spread beyond the Republic's immediate control, carried by example. This further isolated groups that refused to conform. For the new Khans, this growing consensus was dangerous. It painted them not as survivors, but as relics of a violent past. Their way of life was increasingly viewed as incompatible with the future the Republic promised. This framing stripped nuance from their history, reducing them to obstacles rather than people shaped by loss. Memory played a critical role during this period. Elders reminded younger members of what had happened before, of how cooperation with settlements had ended in destruction. These reminders were not exaggerated. They were sincere, rooted in lived experience. Yet as the world changed, the context around those memories shifted, making them harder for outsiders to understand. The Republic did not see the Khans as trauma. It saw statistics, patrol reports, and security concerns. It did not remember the destroyed camp or the scattered survivors. It remembered raids and threats. This asymmetry of memory deepened resentment on both sides. As the NCR solidified its power, the new Khans faced a narrowing set of options. To fight openly was to invite annihilation. To submit was to abandon identity. To flee meant entering unknown territory with no guarantee of safety. None of these choices offered relief from fear. Yet despite the pressure, the new Khans endured. They adjusted routes, altered tactics, and leaned further into isolation. They watched the Republic grow from a distance, wary and resentful, convinced that its expansion was a prelude to their own erasure. The wasteland was becoming a place of laws and borders, and the new Khans existed between them, increasingly out of place. The rise of the NCR marked a turning point, not because it immediately destroyed the Khans, but because it reshaped the world in which they had learned to survive. From this point forward, their story would be defined not only by past trauma, but by constant pressure from an order that believed itself inevitable. The new Khans were struggling to find a place within it, or beyond it, before it was too late. As the influence of the new California Republic continued to expand, tension between its patrols and the new Khans intensified into a steady pattern of conflict. What had once been isolated encounters became routine. The borderlands between NCR territory and the open wastes turned into contested spaces where neither side felt secure. Movement was watched, intentions were questioned, violence became expected rather than exceptional. For the Republic, these clashes were framed as enforcement. Patrols were tasked with securing trade routes, protecting settlers, and eliminating threats to stability. The new Khans were classified as one such threat, their past actions used as justification for constant surveillance and intervention. Orders were issued from distant offices, far removed from the individuals who would carry them out. For the new Khans, these same encounters felt like harassment and provocation. Patrols appeared where none had existed before. Checkpoints restricted movement. Demands were made without explanation. The wasteland they had navigated freely for years now came with invisible lines that carried lethal consequences if crossed. Skirmishes often began without warning. A scouting party would be spotted and pursued. A patrol would stumble into an ambush. Gunfire echoed briefly, then faded, leaving behind bodies and unanswered questions. They were fragments of a larger conflict, eroding trust and escalating resentment on both sides. Each clash added to a growing sense of inevitability. The Republic interpreted resistance as proof that the new Khans were irredeemable. The new Khans interpreted enforcement as confirmation that coexistence was impossible. Neither side believed the other capable of restraint. The nature of these border wars differed from earlier conflicts. The NCR did not rely on intimidation alone. It documented incidents, adjusted patrol routes, and increased manpower strategically. Losses were recorded, patterns were analyzed, violence became data, fed into an expanding bureaucratic system designed to reduce uncertainty. This approach unsettled the new Khans. They were accustomed to fighting opponents who reacted emotionally, who retaliated quickly and then withdrew. The Republic did neither. It responded methodically, escalating pressure over time rather than delivering sudden blows. Each skirmish brought increased presence, tighter control, and fewer places to hide. As a result, daily life grew more constrained. Camps were moved more frequently. Fires were extinguished earlier. Scouts were sent farther out, increasing risk. Sleep became lighter. Anxiety became constant. Survival required vigilance at all hours. The pressure also strained internal cohesion. Members argued over strategy in quiet conversations. Some believed the Khans should strike harder, inflicting enough damage to force the Republic to retreat. Others warned that such actions would only accelerate destruction. These disagreements were never resolved, only postponed by necessity. Chems were used more heavily during this period, not only to dull fear, but to sustain energy during prolonged movement. Exhaustion set in, tempers shortened, mistakes became more common. Each loss felt heavier than the last, compounding grief with frustration. Despite these challenges, the new Khans continued to resist. They knew the terrain better than their pursuers. They avoided open engagements, relying on speed and familiarity with the land. They adapted tactics learned over decades of survival, exploiting moments of overconfidence and fatigue. Yet even successful encounters carried consequences. Each patrol disrupted left-behind evidence. Each ambush increased the Republic's resolve. The cycle fed itself. Violence justified more violence. The borderlands became a place defined by expectation of conflict. The Republic's citizens rarely saw this struggle directly. To them, security reports and reassurances were sufficient. The border wars were distant, abstract, and framed as necessary measures against lawlessness. The complexity of the Khan's history was lost in translation, replaced by simplified narratives of order versus chaos. This disconnect deepened resentment among the new Khans. They felt erased not only physically, but symbolically. Their losses went unacknowledged. Their reasons were dismissed. In this environment, identity hardened further. The Khans became more than a group resisting control. They became a symbol of defiance against a future that excluded them. Younger members grew up knowing nothing else. Border conflict was their normal. They learned to read the signs of approaching patrols, to recognize the hum of distant engines, to measure time by the intervals between skirmishes. Fear was not dramatic. It was routine. As the Republic consolidated power, the border wars shifted subtly. Patrols grew larger, equipment improved, supply lines stabilized, the imbalance became more apparent. Each encounter carried greater risk for the Khans, who lacked the ability to replace losses quickly. This reality forced difficult choices. Some routes were abandoned entirely. Certain territories were conceded without resistance. Retreat became strategy rather than failure. The idea of holding ground faded, replaced by a focus on survival through movement. These withdrawals were not framed as defeats within the group. They were described as necessary adaptations, yet the cumulative effect was undeniable. The new Khans were being pushed outward, away from lands they had known for years, toward harsher and less forgiving regions. The psychological toll of this slow displacement was significant. Anger simmered beneath exhaustion. Hope narrowed to immediate goals. Long-term planning felt impossible. The future was defined not by vision, but by avoidance. Still, the new Khans endured. They had survived annihilation before. They trusted in their ability to adapt, even as the world around them grew increasingly hostile. Each skirmish, each retreat, reinforced the belief that resistance was a matter of survival, not choice. The border wars did not produce a clear victor, they produced attrition. Over time, the Republic's reach extended, and the new Khan's space diminished. The conflict reshaped both sides, but it weighed heavier on those with fewer resources and no recognized claim to legitimacy. By the end of this period, the new Khans stood at a crossroads. Continued resistance risked extinction. Withdrawal meant abandoning familiar lands and confronting unknown dangers. The path forward was unclear, but the pressure was relentless. The border wars had proven one truth beyond doubt. The world was changing, and it was changing without them. If the new Khans wished to survive, they would have to decide whether to keep fighting a rising power or to seek a different future beyond its reach. Bitter Springs was never meant to become a symbol. It was a place chosen out of necessity, not strategy. Nestled near a reliable water source and sheltered by natural terrain, it offered the new Khans a brief sense of stability after years of displacement. It was not heavily fortified. It was not intended as a stronghold. It was simply a place to rest, to regroup, and to exist without constant movement. For the new Khans, Bitter Springs represented a fragile pause in a long retreat. Families gathered there. Children played within sight of watchful adults. Elders told stories beside low fires. Weapons were still close at hand, but the immediate pressure of flight eased. For a moment, survival felt less urgent. This pause did not go unnoticed. To the new California Republic, Bitter Springs appeared differently. Intelligence reports identified it as a Khan encampment, a known raider presence within reach of NCR-controlled territory. Past encounters shaped perception. The Khans were not seen as displaced survivors or families in transition. They were classified as a hostile force, responsible for raids and resistance along the borders. Orders were issued with efficiency and distance. The operation was framed as a necessary strike to eliminate a threat. Context was reduced to coordinates and objectives. The complexity of who occupied Bitter Springs was lost between reports and assumptions. When NCR forces arrived, the outcome unfolded quickly and irreversibly. The attack did not distinguish clearly between fighters and non-combatants. Within the new Khans, the event became something far more than an entry in a ledger. Bitter Springs joined the earlier massacre as a defining wound layered atop existing trauma. This second loss deepened despair and hardened resolve simultaneously. It was no longer possible to frame their suffering as isolated or accidental. A pattern had emerged, one that confirmed their belief that they were expendable in the eyes of those who claimed to bring order. Memory of Bitter Springs spread quickly among the Khans, carried by those who survived and those who listened. The details were vivid: the sound of gunfire, the confusion, the helplessness. These memories were not abstract. They were sensory, immediate, and persistent. Children who escaped Bitter Springs grew up with these memories etched into their understanding of the world. For them, the NCR was not a distant government. It was the force that had destroyed their home and killed their kin. The idea of reconciliation became almost unthinkable. Anger followed grief, but it was not explosive. It was heavy and constant. The kind of anger that reshapes identity rather than demanding immediate action. The Khans did not respond with a unified counterattack. They lacked the resources and cohesion for such a response. Instead, the anger settled inward, reinforcing isolation and mistrust. Elders spoke of Bitter Springs with a mixture of sorrow and certainty. They framed it as proof of what they had always warned against. Settlements, governments, and armies did not see people. They saw threats to be removed. This narrative solidified quickly, leaving little room for alternative interpretations. The massacre also altered internal dynamics. Leaders who had advocated caution lost influence. Their warnings had not prevented tragedy. Those who emphasized strength and resistance gained authority, not because they offered solutions, but because they articulated the pain most clearly. Chems became more prevalent in the aftermath. Grief demanded escape. Sleep became difficult. Silence felt unbearable. Dependency deepened, masking trauma without addressing it. Healing was postponed indefinitely. Outside the Khans, Bitter Springs became a point of quiet controversy. Some NCR soldiers questioned the operation. Doubt lingered, but it did not lead to accountability or change. The machinery of the Republic continued to operate, absorbing the event without slowing. This lack of response intensified the Khans' sense of invisibility. Their suffering had not altered policy. Their loss had not mattered enough to reshape behavior. This realization cut deeply, reinforcing the belief that survival depended solely on themselves. Bitter Springs did not mark the end of the Khans, but it narrowed their future. Each step forward carried the shadow of potential repetition. The massacre also became a cautionary boundary within their collective memory. Settlements were no longer just untrustworthy, they were lethal. Any place that appeared stable was suspect. Any promise of safety was assumed false. As time passed, Bitter Springs was no longer just remembered as an event. It became a reference point, invoked in decisions large and small. It justified avoidance. It justified aggression. It justified despair. For the new Khans, Bitter Springs confirmed a painful truth. Survival in a world of rising order came at a cost they could not afford to pay. They were caught between a past that would not release them and a future that offered no place. The wasteland moved on, as it always did. Roads reopened, patrols resumed, new conflicts replaced old ones. But within the Khans, time slowed around this moment. Bitter Springs joined the earlier massacre as a permanent scar, shaping every generation that followed. It was the second great wound in a history already defined by loss, and it ensured that the divide between the Khans and the world of law and order would become nearly impossible to bridge. In the aftermath of Bitter Springs, the youngest members of the Khans carried a burden they had not chosen. They were too young to have shaped the events that defined their lives, yet those events shaped them all the same. Loss was not something they learned about later. It was present from the beginning, embedded in memory before understanding could fully form. For these children, the world was introduced through absence. Parents did not return from the chaos. Siblings were lost in the confusion of flight. Familiar voices disappeared, leaving behind questions that were answered only with silence or carefully chosen words. The wasteland did not pause to explain itself. It demanded adaptation without offering clarity. As they grew, stories filled the gaps left by memory. They described it as a moment when trust had proven fatal, when safety had revealed itself as illusion. These stories were told quietly, without embellishment, their power drawn from repetition rather than drama. The children listened, absorbing meaning even when details blurred. What remained clear was the emotion behind the words. Grief was present, steady and unresolved. Anger was there as well, but it was subdued, expressed through tone rather than volume. Together, these emotions shaped how the children understood the world beyond their group. Play reflected this understanding. Games mirrored survival rather than innocence. Mock patrols were staged, ambushes were imagined. Roles were assigned based on strength and vigilance rather than curiosity. Even at rest, attention remained fixed on the horizon, where danger was always expected. Education within the Khans did not follow structured lessons, but it was thorough. Children learned to recognize the sound of approaching engines, the shape of distant uniforms, the signs of recently traveled roads. They learned when to hide and when to move. These lessons were taught not through instruction, but through demonstration and necessity. Fear became familiar, but it was not paralyzing. It was integrated into daily life, treated as something to be managed rather than avoided. This familiarity dulled its sharpest edges while ensuring it never disappeared. Caution became instinctive, guiding movement and behavior without conscious thought. The absence of grief rituals shaped emotional expression. There was little space to mourn openly. Loss was acknowledged, then folded into routine. Children learned that tears did not change outcomes. What mattered was awareness, preparedness, and loyalty. Vulnerability was private, rarely shared. This environment fostered resilience, but it also limited imagination. Futures were envisioned narrowly, defined by survival rather than possibility. Dreams did not extend far beyond the next season. Stability felt temporary by definition, something that could be taken without warning. The children of Bitter Springs grew up knowing that they were different from the world beyond their group. Settlements were described as dangerous, not because of their chaos, but because of their order. Uniforms, laws, and walls were framed as threats disguised as safety. This perspective was reinforced with every retelling of past events. As these children matured, the massacre became less a memory and more a foundation. The belief that the world was hostile and unjust was accepted as fact, not opinion. This belief provided coherence in a world that offered little else. Yet within this shared trauma, individuality persisted. Others leaned into aggression, channeling pain into readiness for conflict. Both responses were accepted. Both were understood as natural outcomes of loss. Elders watched these developments with a mixture of pride and sorrow. They saw strength in the children's adaptability, but they also recognized the cost. The next generation was being shaped by fear rather than choice. Healing had been postponed again, deferred in favor of survival. Attempts to soften this influence were rare and subtle. Stories of cooperation and peace existed, but they were framed as cautionary tales rather than aspirations. Examples of kindness were acknowledged, but always paired with warnings about betrayal. Hope was treated carefully, as something that could mislead if held too tightly. The wasteland offered few counterexamples. NCR patrols remained distant but present, reinforcing existing beliefs. News from other regions arrived, filtered through resentment and suspicion. There was little opportunity for direct comparison or reassessment. Isolation protected the children physically, but it narrowed their understanding. As the children of Bitter Springs became adolescents, their identity as Khans solidified. They did not remember a time before loss. They did not know a world without displacement. What they inherited was not just a history, but an expectation. They were expected to endure, to remain vigilant, to carry memory forward. This expectation shaped how they viewed leadership, authority, and change. Elders were respected because they remembered. Outsiders were distrusted because they did not. New ideas were weighed against old wounds, often found lacking. The trauma did not break these children. It forged them into something durable, but rigid. Flexibility, when it appeared, came slowly and cautiously. Trust required proof measured over long periods, if it was allowed at all. In this way, Bitter Springs extended beyond a single moment. It lived on through those who survived it and those who grew up in its shadow. The massacre shaped not only memory, but possibility. It narrowed the paths the Khans believed were open to them. The children carried this legacy quietly, not as a burden they questioned, but as a truth they accepted. It became part of their understanding of the world, as fundamental as the land beneath their feet. Through them, the wounds of the past continued to influence the future, ensuring that Bitter Springs would never truly fade. It remained present in behavior, belief, and silence, shaping a generation that had learned early that survival often came at the cost of hope. After Bitter Springs, the new Khans could no longer exist as they had before. Survival alone was no longer enough to hold them together. Loss had hollowed out their identity, leaving behind fragments that no longer fit the world forming around them. In the quiet years that followed, a change began to take shape, not through sudden declaration, but through gradual consensus. The name New Khans began to feel insufficient. It tied them too closely to a recent past, defined by reaction rather than intention. It carried the weight of survival, but not direction. As elders spoke and younger members listened, a different understanding emerged. They were no longer simply rebuilding after disaster. They were redefining what it meant to endure. The shift toward calling themselves the Great Khans was subtle. It did not begin with ceremony or proclamation. It began in language, in the way members referred to one another and to their shared history. The word great did not imply dominance or conquest. It was meant to signify continuity. It acknowledged that despite repeated attempts to erase them, they remained. This transformation was rooted in memory. Elders framed the new name as a bridge between generations, connecting those who had survived Vault 15, the first massacre, and Bitter Springs. The Great Khans were not just a group living in the present. They were a lineage shaped by endurance across time. The name carried that weight forward. With this change came a re-examination of values. Violence remained part of their way of life, but it was no longer celebrated without reflection. Strength was redefined. It was not only the ability to inflict harm, but the ability to persist without dissolving into chaos. Honor became a concept spoken of more often, though its meaning varied. Honor, among the Great Khans, did not align with the laws of settlements or the codes of expanding governments. It was internal. It meant loyalty to the group, respect for elders, and remembrance of the dead. It meant carrying history accurately, without distortion, for comfort or convenience. Ritual began to replace improvisation. Stories were told in specific ways, preserving key moments and lessons. Names of the fallen were repeated deliberately, ensuring they were not lost to time. Children were taught not only how to survive, but why survival mattered. Memory became structured, no longer left to chance. The Great Khans also began to see themselves as something distinct from other raider groups. While they still relied on raiding and the chem trade, they viewed these actions as means rather than identity. They were tools for survival, not expressions of purpose. This distinction mattered internally, even if outsiders failed to recognize it. This sense of distinction fostered a fragile cohesion. Members felt bound not only by necessity, but by shared understanding. Disputes still occurred, but they were mediated through reference to collective history. Decisions were weighed against the past, measured by whether they honored or diminished what had been endured. Despite this internal strengthening, isolation persisted. The Great Khans did not seek reconciliation with the NCR or other settlements. Their new identity did not include forgiveness. The wounds of Bitter Springs were too recent, too deep. Change was inward, not outward. The adoption of the Great Khan's name also reshaped leadership dynamics. Elders who embodied memory gained influence, but so did those who could articulate a future that extended beyond constant retreat. Authority became a balance between remembrance and adaptation. Neither was sufficient alone. Younger members began to take on roles that blended tradition with pragmatism. Scouts gathered information not only for immediate survival, but to understand broader shifts in the wasteland. Traders navigated chem exchanges with increased caution, aware of the long-term risks of dependency. These changes were small, but meaningful. Yet progress remained uneven. Chems continued to exert influence, dulling pain while slowing growth. Some members resisted the new framing, clinging to older identities rooted in unrestrained aggression. These tensions did not fracture the group, but they prevented full transformation. The Great Khans existed in a state of transition. They had named themselves, but they had not yet defined their destination. Their identity was clearer, but their future remained uncertain. Memory provided cohesion, but it also constrained imagination. Still, the act of transformation mattered. It marked a refusal to disappear quietly. The great Khans were asserting that their story did not end in massacre or displacement. It continued, shaped by choice as well as circumstance. This redefinition also altered how they viewed the world beyond their camps. The NCR was no longer simply an enemy, it was a force representing a different philosophy of survival. The great Khans did not seek to dismantle it directly, they sought to exist apart from it, on their own terms. As the wasteland shifted around them, the great Khans stood rooted in memory, yet slowly reaching forward. Their identity was no longer reactive alone, it was reflective. They understood who they had been and why. The challenge ahead lay in deciding who they could become without losing themselves. The name Great Khans carried both promise and burden. It honored endurance, but it also demanded responsibility. To live up to it required more than survival. It required restraint, memory, and the willingness to adapt without erasing the past. This chapter did not resolve their struggles, it reframed them. The great Khans had emerged not as conquerors or victims, but as a people shaped by repeated loss who refused to vanish. Their story, now clearly named, would continue into new lands and new conflicts, carrying the weight of history with every step forward. The decision to move eastward did not come as a single command or moment of clarity. It emerged gradually, shaped by exhaustion, pressure, and the quiet recognition that remaining where they were would lead only to further loss. The lands once navigated by the Khans had become increasingly constrained, watched by patrols and claimed by expanding borders. Survival demanded distance. Migration was not unfamiliar to them. Movement had long been part of their identity, yet this journey carried a different weight. It was not a raid or a retreat from immediate danger. It was a deliberate abandonment of places marked by memory, both painful and familiar. Leaving meant acknowledging that the past could no longer anchor the future. The great Khans began to travel in smaller, coordinated groups, spreading risk and reducing visibility. Routes were chosen carefully, favoring harsh terrain over predictable paths. Mountains, deserts, and broken infrastructure offered concealment at the cost of comfort. Progress was slow, measured by safety rather than speed. Along the way, they encountered others pushed to the margins by the same forces: displaced families, independent traders, and remnants of forgotten groups crossed their path. Some encounters ended peacefully, marked by cautious exchanges and shared information. Others ended abruptly, shaped by fear and misunderstanding. The wasteland did not offer consistency. Each mile traveled carried physical strain. Supplies ran low, equipment wore down, injuries lingered longer without stable care. Children struggled with the pace, their endurance tested daily. Elders moved more slowly, supported when possible, left behind only when survival demanded it. These choices were never easy, and they left lasting marks on those who made them. Despite hardship, the journey reinforced cohesion. Shared struggle reminded the great Khans of why they moved together. Camps formed each night with practiced efficiency. Fires were shielded, watches rotated quietly, stories were told sparingly, focused on direction rather than reflection. The past was present, but it no longer dominated every conversation. As they moved farther from NCR influence, the pressure eased slightly. Patrols became less frequent. The constant expectation of confrontation softened. This relief was tempered by uncertainty. New regions brought unfamiliar dangers. Mutated creatures adapted to different environments. Weather shifted unpredictably. Knowledge learned in one land did not always apply in another. The great Khans adapted as they always had. Scouts mapped terrain and noted patterns. Leaders adjusted routes based on risk rather than tradition. Flexibility became essential. Pride yielded to necessity. Survival demanded listening as much as strength. This migration also altered internal dynamics. Younger members took on greater responsibility, carrying supplies, scouting ahead, and making decisions in unfamiliar territory. Elders provided guidance rooted in experience, but they no longer dictated every choice. Authority became shared, shaped by circumstance. Memory traveled with them, but it began to change. Stories of bitter springs and earlier losses were still told, but they were framed differently. Distance softened immediacy. Grief remained, but it no longer overwhelmed every moment. Space allowed reflection without constant threat. For some, the journey sparked cautious hope. For others, movement felt like erasure, a betrayal of those lost. These conflicting emotions coexisted, rarely spoken aloud. The great Khans did not announce their arrival in new regions. They observed first, learning local patterns and power structures before engaging. This restraint reflected lessons learned at great cost. Visibility invited danger. Anonymity offered protection. As weeks turned into months, the migration reshaped their identity further. They were no longer defined solely by what they resisted. They were defined by where they were going. The act of choosing a direction, however uncertain, marked a shift from reaction to intention. Yet the journey also revealed limits. Not everyone could endure the pace. Some chose to leave, settling in places that offered stability, even if temporary. These departures were quiet, acknowledged without ceremony. The great Khans understood that survival did not look the same for everyone. Those who continued carried the weight of those left behind, just as they carried the memory of those already lost. Migration did not erase grief, it redistributed it, spreading it across distance and time. The landscape gradually changed, opening into broader expanses and unfamiliar horizons. It was spoken of as a place of opportunity and danger, shaped by forces yet unknown. Rumors traveled faster than certainty. Approaching this new region, the great Khans slowed, reassessing. Movement had brought them here, but arrival demanded caution. Settling too quickly risked repetition of old pattern. Waiting too long risked stagnation. Balance was difficult to find. This migration marked more than a change of location. It marked a transition in how the great Khans related to the world. They were no longer simply being pushed. They were choosing, however constrained those choices remained. The road east did not promise safety or peace. It promised possibility. With each step, the great Khans carried their history forward, not as a chain, but as a weight they had learned to bear. Red Rock Canyon offered something the great Khans had not known in years. It was not safety, and it was not abundance, but it was distance. High walls of stone enclosed narrow paths, limiting approaches and offering natural defense. From above, movement could be seen long before it arrived. From below, the canyon appeared empty and uninviting. It was a place easily overlooked, and that was its greatest value. The decision to settle there was cautious. The great Khans did not rush to claim the canyon as home. Scouts spent weeks observing patterns of wind, water, and wildlife. They traced paths used by travelers and marked areas where sound carried farther than expected. Every detail mattered. Bitter springs had taught them what happened when rest was mistaken for safety. Life in Red Rock Canyon developed slowly. Shelters were built into the stone rather than standing apart from it. Fires were kept low, their smoke dispersed carefully. Supplies were stored in multiple locations rather than centralized. Nothing was allowed to become singular enough to destroy them all at once. Isolation shaped daily routines. Contact with the outside world was limited and deliberate. Trade occurred infrequently, handled by a small number of trusted members who traveled light and returned quickly. Information was valued more than goods. Knowledge of shifting power in the Mojave mattered more than caps or chems. The canyon itself imposed rhythm. Mornings were quiet, broken only by wind moving through rock. Midday heat forced stillness. Evenings brought brief activity before darkness returned. This predictability offered a form of stability unfamiliar to many within the Great Khans. It was not comfort, but it was consistency. Children grew up knowing the contours of the canyon as intimately as others knew streets or fields. They learned where echoes traveled and where silence held. Games adapted to terrain, emphasizing awareness and agility rather than open pursuit. The land itself became a teacher, shaping behavior without instruction. Red Rock Canyon also reinforced separation. Settlements of the Mojave felt distant, both physically and culturally. Their lights were not visible from the canyon. Their routines did not dictate daily life. This distance allowed the Great Khans to exist without constant reference to the NCR or other emerging powers. Yet, isolation carried its own risks. Resources were limited. Water had to be managed carefully. Overuse meant depletion. The Great Khans learned restraint out of necessity, rationing and rotating use to avoid collapse. This discipline contrasted sharply with earlier years marked by excess and waste. The chem trade found a place within this new balance. It provided leverage without requiring frequent travel. Chems could be moved discreetly through intermediaries, reducing exposure. This economy sustained the Great Khans materially, but it also reinforced dependency, both within the group and among those they traded with. Leadership within Red Rock Canyon took on a quieter form. Authority was less visible, expressed through routine rather than command. Decisions were made collectively, guided by elders and enforced through shared understanding. Conflict still occurred, but it was contained. The canyon did not allow chaos to spread easily. Papa Khan emerged as a central figure during this period, not through force alone, but through presence. He embodied memory, carrying the weight of both massacres and the long retreat east. His authority rested on experience rather than ambition. He spoke rarely, but when he did, others listened. Under this leadership, traditions solidified. Stories were told in consistent forms, repeated until their structure became familiar. Names of the dead were remembered. Lessons were drawn carefully, avoiding exaggeration. Memory became deliberate, curated to preserve meaning without overwhelming daily life. Red Rock Canyon allowed the Great Khans to exist as a people rather than a movement. They were no longer defined solely by where they were going or what they were fleeing. They had arrived somewhere, even if that arrival was provisional. This sense of place altered perspective. Still, the canyon was never mistaken for permanence. Escape routes remained clear. Supplies were packed in ways that allowed rapid departure. Children were taught that the canyon was shelter, not sanctuary. Safety was conditional and temporary. The Mojave beyond the canyon remained active and unpredictable. New factions rose and fell. Rumors traveled of armies, machines, and old-world cities reborn. The Great Khans listened from a distance, weighing each development against their own capacity to respond. Red Rock Canyon became a vantage point rather than a destination. Opportunities passed by, unnoticed or deliberately ignored. For some, the canyon represented stagnation. Younger members questioned whether hiding was survival or surrender. These doubts were rarely voiced openly, but they lingered beneath the surface. The balance between safety and relevance was fragile. Despite these tensions, Red Rock Canyon held. It provided space for recovery, however incomplete. Wounds did not heal fully, but they stopped reopening daily. Fear remained, but it softened around the edges. This fragile equilibrium defined the Great Khan's time in the canyon. They were no longer running, but they were not moving forward either. They existed in suspension, protected by stone and shaped by memory. Red Rock Canyon was not the future the Great Khans had imagined, but it was a pause they desperately needed. Within its walls, they preserved themselves, waiting for a moment when survival might become something more than endurance. Papa Khan did not seek leadership. By the time the Great Khans settled into Red Rock Canyon, authority had already found him through endurance rather than ambition. He had survived Vault 15. He had survived the destruction of the first camp. He had survived Bitter Springs. His body carried the marks of those years, and his voice carried the weight of memory. In a people defined by loss, survival itself became legitimacy. His leadership was not loud. He did not issue frequent orders or enforce obedience through fear. Instead, he embodied continuity. When Papa Khan spoke, he did so from experience rather than strategy. He did not promise victory or safety. He reminded the Great Khans of what had already been lost and what must never be repeated. Papa Khan viewed history as instruction, not burden. To him, the past was not something to escape or soften. It was something to be honored through vigilance. Bitter Springs was not a tragedy to be mourned and set aside. It was a warning etched into memory, meant to guide every decision that followed. Under his leadership, the Great Khans became more inward-looking. Papa Khan distrusted the outside world instinctively, not out of paranoia, but out of lived evidence. Settlements had brought destruction, governments had brought massacres, promises had brought graves. In his view, survival depended on distance from all of them. This worldview shaped policy, even when it was not formally stated. The Great Khans avoided alliances. They rejected overtures from larger powers. They remained in Red Rock Canyon not because it offered opportunity, but because it limited exposure. Papa Khan valued obscurity over influence. To younger members, this caution sometimes felt like stagnation. They had grown up in the canyon, hearing stories of past losses, but not experiencing them firsthand. To them, the world beyond the canyon represented possibility as well as danger. Papa Khan's reluctance to engage felt like fear disguised as wisdom. Papa Khan did not dismiss these concerns outright. He listened, but his responses were grounded in memory. He reminded them that every step toward the wider world had previously ended in blood. Progress, in his view, was not expansion, it was continued existence. Anything that risked that was unacceptable. His leadership style relied heavily on elders. Decisions were discussed among those who remembered the early years most clearly. This preserved institutional memory, but also narrowed perspective. Change moved slowly, filtered through caution and precedent. Papa Khan placed immense value on tradition. Ritualized storytelling, remembrance of the dead, and preservation of identity were not cultural preferences. They were survival mechanisms. Forgetting, he believed, was the first step toward destruction. Memory kept the Great Khans alert in a world that rewarded complacency with violence. Yet this emphasis on memory came at a cost. The Great Khans became anchored to the past so tightly that imagining a different future grew difficult. Papa Khan's authority rested on what had happened, not on what could happen. His leadership ensured safety, but it did not offer direction beyond preservation. Chems were a point of quiet contradiction under Papa Khan's rule. He did not encourage dependency, but he tolerated it. The chem trade sustained the Great Khans economically and provided leverage without requiring territorial expansion. To Papa Khan, it was a necessary compromise in an unforgiving world. Addressing its long-term consequences felt secondary to immediate survival. Papa Khan's relationship with younger leaders was complex. Figures like Regis and Melissa respected him deeply, but they also recognized the limitations of his approach. They saw that the world of the Mojave was changing rapidly. New powers were rising, old conflicts were shifting. Remaining isolated indefinitely carried its own risks. These tensions rarely surfaced as open conflict. Papa Khan's authority was rarely challenged directly. Instead, disagreements manifested in quiet adjustments, delayed decisions, and unspoken divisions. The Great Khans functioned, but not always cohesively. Despite these strains, Papa Khan remained a stabilizing force. His presence prevented fragmentation. His memory anchored identity. In moments of crisis, his voice carried clarity, rooted in lived experience. The Great Khans trusted him because he had endured when others had fallen. Papa Khan also understood, even if he did not articulate it openly, that his leadership was temporary. He did not see himself as the future of the Great Khan. He saw himself as a guardian of continuity, a bridge between generations shaped by catastrophe and those yet to choose their path. In quiet moments, Papa Khan was reflective. He walked the canyon paths alone, observing the land and the people who depended on him. He carried the names of the dead with him, repeating them silently. Leadership, for him, was not power. The Great Khans, under Papa Khan's guidance, existed in a state of guarded stillness. They were protected but constrained, safe but uncertain. The canyon walls kept enemies out, but they also kept possibility at a distance. Papa Khan did not offer the Great Khans a future defined by growth or reconciliation. He offered them survival without surrender. To him, that was enough. Whether it would remain enough for the generations that followed was a question he did not attempt to answer. His leadership ensured that the Great Khans would not vanish quietly into the wasteland. They would endure, carrying their history intact. But endurance alone could not resolve the tension between memory and change. That struggle waited, patient and inevitable, just beyond the canyon walls. The Mojave did not remain quiet for long. Even as the Great Khans held to the shelter of Red Rock Canyon, new forces pressed into the region, carrying unfamiliar symbols and an uncompromising vision of order. Among them was Caesar's legion, advancing steadily from the east, reshaping every place it touched through discipline, fear, and conquest. Its presence altered the balance of the Mojave, casting a long shadow that reached even into the canyon. At first, the legion was known only through rumor. Traders spoke of roads cleared by force, of towns subdued and remade, of men stripped of identity and remolded into soldiers. Stories carried fragments of truth and exaggeration alike, but a pattern emerged that could not be ignored. Wherever the legion advanced, it did not negotiate. It absorbed or destroyed. For the Great Khans, this new power represented both threat and opportunity. The legion shared their hatred of the new California Republic. It opposed the same expansion that had driven the Khans into retreat and isolation. This shared enemy created a point of connection, however uneasy. Initial contact was cautious. Legion representatives approached the Khans not with threats, but with respect carefully performed. They spoke of strength, endurance, and the failures of weak societies. They framed the Republic as corrupt and decadent, a structure doomed to collapse under its own contradictions. These words resonated with memories already carried by the Great Khans. The Legion offered alliance, but it was an alliance defined by hierarchy rather than equality. Caesar's vision allowed no true partners, only tools aligned temporarily with his purpose. This imbalance was not hidden. It was presented as natural order. Strength commanded, weakness obeyed. Papa Khan listened to these offers with guarded interest. The Legion's rhetoric echoed his own distrust of settlements and governments. It validated his belief that the Republic's expansion was not progress, but decay disguised as order. Yet he also sensed the danger beneath the Legion's discipline. This was not a force that tolerated independence. For some among the Great Khans, The Legion's arrival felt like a return to clarity. The world, they believed, respected strength alone. Caesar's Legion embodied that principle without apology. To align with it seemed practical, even inevitable, in a Mojave increasingly dominated by larger powers. Others saw the Legion differently. They noticed the absence of freedom in its ranks, the erasure of identity, the rigid control enforced through violence. They understood that alliance would come at the cost of autonomy, perhaps even survival as a distinct people. These concerns circulated quietly, rarely voiced in full. The Legion's influence seeped in gradually. It did not demand immediate submission. It offered purpose, validation, and direction. It praised the Khan's resilience and combat experience, framing them as worthy contributors to a greater cause. This recognition mattered to a people long dismissed as raiders and threats. At the same time, the Legion exploited the Khan's isolation. Cut off from broader trade networks and wary of the NCR, the Great Khans had limited options. The Legion presented itself as an alternative future, one that promised protection from the Republic and a role in shaping the Mojave's fate. Chemtrade connections deepened this relationship. The Legion's demand for chems provided the Khans with leverage and resources. Transactions were conducted efficiently, reinforcing the sense of mutual benefit, yet dependence grew quietly, binding the Khans closer to a force that viewed them as expendable. Within Red Rock Canyon, debate intensified. The Legion, in his view, represented strength unburdened by the compromises that had led to repeated Khan losses. Alliance felt like reclaiming agency rather than surrendering it. Younger leaders, however, remained uncertain. They questioned whether replacing one dominating power with another truly served the Khans' survival. The Legion's respect was conditional. Its discipline left no room for dissent. The fate of other groups absorbed by the Legion served as silent warnings. Despite these concerns, the Legion's shadow loomed larger each day. Its armies moved closer. Its victories reshaped the region. Neutrality became harder to maintain. The Great Khans could not remain unseen forever. The Legion's presence also reframed the Khans' relationship with violence. Under NCR pressure, violence had been reactive and defensive. The Legion framed it as purposeful, transformative. War, in this vision, was not chaos but order imposed through force. Yet beneath the rhetoric lay a stark truth. The Legion did not preserve cultures. It consumed them. Traditions were tolerated only if they served Caesar's narrative. Identity was reshaped to fit a single vision. For a people whose survival depended on memory, this posed an existential threat. Papa Khan struggled with this tension. His loyalty to the past conflicted with his desire to prevent future massacres. He believed that standing alongside the Legion could finally halt the cycle of retreat and loss. Whether that belief was rooted in strategy or desperation was difficult to discern. The Legion, for its part, was patient. It allowed the Khans time to decide, confident that pressure would resolve hesitation. Each NCR advance, each skirmish along contested routes, reinforced the Legion's argument. The world was dividing, and those who did not choose a side would be crushed between them. As the Legion's shadow stretched over the Mojave, the Great Khans found themselves at a crossroads. Alliance promised relevance and revenge, but threatened identity. Resistance promised autonomy, but risked annihilation. Neutrality promised neither safety nor future. This moment did not produce immediate resolution. It deepened existing fractures and postponed decision through uncertainty. For the first time since Bitter Springs, their fate was not shaped solely by reaction. A choice, however constrained, lay before them. The Legion's shadow lingered over Red Rock Canyon, heavy and unyielding. It did not force action, but it demanded reckoning. For the Great Khans, the question was no longer whether the world would change. but whether they would shape that change or be reshaped by it. The answer would come later, carried by outsiders, by shifting alliances, and by decisions that could not be undone. For now, the Legion waited, and the great Khans listened, suspended between memory and an uncertain future. As the Legion's presence settled into the Mojave like a gathering storm, the great Khans found themselves pulled inward, forced to confront questions they had long avoided. Red Rock Canyon, once a refuge from outside pressure, became a place of quiet debate. The stone walls that had protected them now amplified voices, carrying disagreements that could no longer be contained by silence. The central conflict was not about enemies, but about identity. For generations, survival had been defined by resistance, memory, and caution. Now, a choice loomed that demanded more than endurance. It demanded direction. The question was not simply who to oppose, but what kind of people the great Khans intended to be. Elders spoke first, grounding every argument in history. They remembered the cost of trust. They remembered the camps destroyed and the promises broken. To them, the Legion's offer felt familiar. Another powerful force. Another claim of inevitability. They warned that submission, even framed as alliance, would end the same way it always had, with loss and erasure. Others countered that isolation had brought its own losses. Bitter springs had happened while they were hiding, not fighting. Retreat had not saved them then. In a world dominated by expanding powers, remaining apart might no longer be viable. Strength, some argued, required engagement, not withdrawal. These conversations did not take place in councils or assemblies. They unfolded gradually, in fragments, a remark shared during watch, a disagreement voiced while dividing supplies, a story told with altered emphasis. Over time, patterns emerged, revealing fault lines that ran deeper than strategy. Younger members, particularly those who had grown up in Red Rock Canyon, struggled with the weight of inherited trauma. They respected the past, but they did not live within it. For them, the stories of Bitter Springs were real, but distant. Their daily reality was shaped by stagnation, limited opportunity, and the sense of being trapped between forces beyond their control. To these younger Khans, the Legion represented movement. It offered purpose, however brutal. It promised an end to drifting, a chance to matter in the shaping of the Mojave. This promise was seductive, not because it guaranteed safety, but because it replaced uncertainty with structure. Others among the youth rejected this vision entirely. They saw in the Legion a future worse than extinction, a future where the Khans would survive only as a name, stripped of autonomy and tradition. They feared that joining the Legion would erase everything the great Khans had endured to preserve. The chemtrade complicated these debates. It tied the Khans materially to the Legion while reinforcing dependency within their own ranks. Some viewed this as leverage, proof that the Khans still held value. Others saw it as the first step towards subjugation, a chain disguised as opportunity. Papa Khan listened to all of this without intervening directly. His silence carried weight. Many interpreted it as agreement with the Legion's approach. Others believed he was simply measuring the cost of every option. His authority rested on memory, but memory alone could not resolve the future. Regis and Melissa, among others, represented a quieter resistance. They did not argue for immediate alliance or confrontation. Instead, they questioned assumptions. They asked whether survival had to mean repeating the same cycles under new banners. They spoke of alternatives, vague and uncertain, but rooted in the desire to break free from endless reaction. These perspectives did not dominate discussions, but they lingered. They introduced doubt into what might otherwise have become inevitability. The idea that the Khans could choose a path not defined solely by opposition began to surface, tentative and fragile. Tradition became both anchor and obstacle. Rituals, meant to preserve identity, also reinforced rigidity. Stories repeated too often lost nuance, becoming commandments rather than lessons. The past, once a guide, threatened to become a prison. The canyon reflected this tension. Its walls provided safety, but they also confined. Looking outward from its heights, the Mojave appeared vast and active, full of forces shaping the future. Remaining still felt increasingly unnatural. Fear underlay every argument. Fear of annihilation, fear of submission, fear of losing what little identity remained. These fears did not cancel each other out. They accumulated, weighing on every decision. The great Khans did not reach consensus during this period. Instead, they learned to live with disagreement. Survival demanded cooperation despite ideological division. Raids were planned. Supplies were managed. Life continued, even as uncertainty deepened. What changed most was awareness. The Khans became acutely conscious that their current existence was temporary. Red Rock Canyon could not shield them forever. The Legion would not wait indefinitely. The NCR would continue to expand. Choice, delayed long enough, would be made for them. This realization did not bring clarity, but it brought urgency. Conversations grew more frequent. Younger members listened more closely to elders, and elders listened, however reluctantly, to the concerns of the young. The future was no longer an abstract concept. It pressed against the present. In this tension between tradition and survival, the great Khans stood at the edge of transformation. They had endured loss, displacement, and isolation. Now they faced a different kind of threat, one that demanded change rather than endurance alone. Whether they would adapt without losing themselves remained uncertain. What was clear was that the world beyond the canyon was closing in, and the space for indecision was shrinking. The crossroads had been reached, even if the path forward remained obscured. Within the uncertainty that settled over Red Rock Canyon, certain voices began to stand out, not through force or defiance, but through quiet persistence. Among them were figures like Regis and Melissa, individuals shaped by the same losses as the rest of the great Khans, yet unwilling to let those losses define every possibility ahead. They did not deny the past. They carried it carefully, choosing when to invoke it and when to look beyond it. Regis, as a senior advisor, spoke with respect for tradition but without surrendering to it entirely. He understood the authority of memory, yet he questioned its exclusivity. To him, remembrance was a guide, not a commandment. He listened closely to elders, absorbing their stories and warnings, but he also watched the changing Mojave with a strategist's eye. He saw patterns forming that could not be ignored. Melissa represented a different perspective, one shaped by the realities of the present rather than the weight of distant memory. She had grown up amid isolation and stagnation, witnessing the limits of survival without direction. For her, the canyon felt less like refuge and more like confinement. The world beyond it was dangerous, but it was also alive with movement and possibility. Neither Regis nor Melissa advocated blind trust or reckless alliance. Their arguments were careful, measured, and often framed as questions rather than declarations. They asked what survival meant if it led only to disappearance. They asked whether preserving identity required isolation, or whether identity could evolve without being erased. These questions unsettled the established order. They did not attack Papa Khan's leadership directly, nor did they dismiss the trauma that defined it. Instead, they introduced complexity into conversations long dominated by certainty. In doing so, they made space for doubt, and doubt, however uncomfortable, allowed thought. Regis often spoke of the long view. He pointed out that the great Khans had endured not because they resisted change entirely, but because they adapted when necessary. Movement eastward had been adaptation. Settlement in Red Rock Canyon had been adaptation. To remain unchanged now, he suggested, might be the greatest risk of all. Melissa focused on the cost of stagnation. She observed how younger members drifted toward chems, how ambition faded into routine, how skills dulled without challenge. Survival without purpose, she argued, hollowed people out slowly. The canyon protected bodies, but it did not nourish futures. Their perspectives resonated most strongly with the younger generation, those who had inherited trauma but not its context. These youths listened closely, drawn to the idea that their lives might hold more than repetition of old wounds. For them, Regis and Melissa offered language to articulate feelings they had long suppressed. This shift did not happen loudly or quickly. There were no rallies or confrontations. Change crept in through conversation, through moments of shared reflection. A younger Khan would ask an elder a question that lingered longer than expected. An elder would pause before answering, uncertain for the first time. Papa Khan observed these developments with mixed emotion. He respected Regis's loyalty and Melissa's strength, yet he feared the fragility of the alternatives they hinted at. He had seen what happened when the Khans trusted outsiders. He had lived through the consequences. His caution was not stubbornness. It was memory made instinct. Still, even Papa Khan could not deny the changing landscape. The Legion pressed closer. The NCR remained ever present. The canyon, for all its protection, offered no solution to these pressures. Silence could not hold forever. Regis and Melissa did not offer a clear destination. They spoke instead of possibility, of paths not yet walked, of the idea that survival might include growth rather than avoidance. These concepts were unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, to a people shaped by loss, yet they lingered, refusing to fade. The tension between these perspectives and Papa Khan's caution created a delicate balance. Authority remained intact, but influence began to diversify. Decisions were no longer guided by memory alone. They were informed by observation and anticipation. This shift did not diminish respect for the past. Bitter springs and earlier massacres were still remembered, still honored. What changed was their role. They became reference points rather than boundaries, warnings rather than walls. The chem trade, long accepted as necessity, came under quiet scrutiny. Melissa questioned its cost openly, noting how it weakened resolve and blurred focus. Regis supported these concerns, framing them as issues of long-term survival rather than morality. These conversations were uncomfortable, but they persisted. For the first time in years, the great Khans began to imagine futures not defined solely by opposition to the NCR or alignment with the Legion. These futures were vague, uncertain, and fraught with risk. Yet imagining them marked a departure from stagnation. Not everyone welcomed this shift. Some dismissed it as weakness, arguing that uncertainty invited destruction. Others feared that questioning tradition dishonored the dead. These objections were sincere, rooted in fear of repeating history. Regis and Melissa did not seek to replace Papa Khan. They understood his importance as a living link to the past. Instead, they positioned themselves as complements rather than challengers. They carried the present and future, just as Papa Khan carried memory. This balance created tension, but it also created resilience. The great Khans were no longer defined by a single voice or vision. They became a conversation, ongoing and unresolved. This complexity mirrored the world beyond the canyon, preparing them, perhaps unintentionally, for engagement. As the Mojave continued to shift, these new perspectives ensured that the great Khans would not face the future blind. They would carry their history forward, but they would also look ahead, however cautiously. The presence of Regis and Melissa did not solve the great Khan's dilemmas. It reframed them. It introduced the idea that survival could include choice and that identity could persist through change. In the quiet of Red Rock Canyon, beneath stone walls shaped by time, the great Khans began to listen not only to their past, but to the possibility of something different. Change arrived not as an army or decree, but as a single figure moving through the Mojave with quiet persistence. The courier did not come to Red Rock Canyon with banners or demands. They arrived as many outsiders did, cautiously and without clear intention. Yet their presence carried weight, shaped by the paths they had already crossed and the forces they had already influenced. To the great Khans, the courier was initially just another variable. Outsiders had come before, usually with predictable outcomes. Most were turned away, some were tolerated briefly, few were trusted. The canyon had learned to be selective. Still, the courier was allowed to enter, guided by curiosity as much as necessity. What set the courier apart was not appearance or authority, but attention. They listened more than they spoke. They asked questions that others avoided. They acknowledged the past without dismissing it or exploiting it. This approach unsettled expectations. The great Khans were accustomed to being seen as obstacles or tools. Being seen as people required adjustment. Conversations unfolded slowly. Stories of bitter springs were shared, not as accusations, but as truths long carried. The courier did not interrupt. They did not defend the NCR reflexively. They absorbed the weight of the history offered, recognizing that memory here was not exaggeration, but survival. For Papa Khan, the courier represented contradiction. Here was an outsider shaped by the wasteland, not by institutions alone. The courier's path suggested that individuals could move between factions without losing themselves entirely. This possibility challenged Papa Khan's belief that the world beyond the canyon offered only destruction. The courier did not argue against Papa Khan directly. They asked what survival meant now, in a Mojave shaped by new powers. They asked whether the great Khans wished to endure unchanged, or endure with purpose. These questions echoed those already raised by Regis and Melissa, but coming from an outsider, they carried different resonance. Regis saw opportunity in these exchanges. The courier validated the idea that engagement did not automatically mean submission, that influence could be exerted without erasure, that paths existed beyond the binary of NCR domination or Legion subjugation. This validation mattered. It gave shape to possibilities previously considered too abstract to pursue. Melissa watched the courier with cautious optimism. She saw in them a reflection of what movement through the wasteland could become when guided by choice rather than reaction. The courier had survived without retreating into isolation. That example alone was powerful. The courier's role was not to dictate outcomes. They did not promise protection or reward. Instead, they offered perspective. They spoke of other tribes, other settlements, other ways of existing that did not align perfectly with either major power. These stories expanded the Khan's understanding of the Mojave beyond the narrow frame of conflict. At the same time, the courier made the consequences of inaction clear. The Legion would not tolerate prolonged hesitation. The NCR would continue to expand. Remaining still was itself a decision, one likely to end poorly. This framing shifted urgency without coercion. The presence of the courier also forced the great Khans to confront internal contradictions. Their reliance on chems, once accepted as necessity, became harder to justify when framed against long-term survival. The courier did not condemn this trade outright, but they highlighted its costs subtly, allowing the Khans to reach their own conclusions. For the first time in years, the great Khans were confronted with the idea that their future might not be predetermined by past trauma, that their history, while defining, did not have to dictate every choice ahead. This idea was uncomfortable. It threatened certainty, yet it also offered relief. Papa Khan struggled with this shift. His authority rested on memory, and memory warned against trust. Yet the courier did not resemble the forces that had destroyed the Khans before. They did not arrive with orders or overwhelming power. The courier's influence extended beyond words. Their actions elsewhere in the Mojave demonstrated that individuals could alter the course of larger powers. Settlements changed. alliances shifted, outcomes varied based on choice. This reality undermined the belief that the Khans were powerless against the tide of history. For younger members, the courier became a symbol of mobility without erasure, someone who moved through the world without being consumed by it. This image contrasted sharply with both the Legion's absorption and the NCR's assimilation. It offered a third image, incomplete but compelling. The Great Khans did not immediately change course. Decisions of this magnitude required time, yet something fundamental had shifted. The future was no longer a closed space. It had opened slightly, enough to let in doubt, and with it, hope. Papa Khan understood that his role was nearing its end, not because he had failed, but because the nature of leadership required change. The world confronting the Great Khans was not the world he had survived. It demanded different instincts. The courier did not stay to see what decision would be made. Their role was catalyst, not conclusion. They moved on, leaving behind a people forced to reckon with themselves. In the wake of the courier's visit, the Great Khans stood at a threshold. The past remained heavy, but it no longer filled the entire horizon. Memory still guided them, but it did not command them absolutely. For the first time in generations, the Great Khans were not simply reacting to pressure, they were considering choice. What they would do with that choice remained uncertain, but the possibility itself marked a turning point. The canyon remained quiet, but beneath its stillness, something new had begun to take shape. The legacy of Bitter Springs did not fade with time. It lingered in pauses between conversations, in the way decisions were weighed, in the reflexive tightening of posture whenever the NCR was mentioned. Even after the courier's visit introduced new possibilities, the massacre remained the unspoken center around which all future paths were measured. Revisiting Bitter Springs was not a physical act. Few among the Great Khans wished to return to the site itself. The land held too much silence, too many echoes. Instead, the legacy was revisited through memory, through retelling, and through reinterpretation. What had once been a single, fixed narrative began to shift subtly as questions were asked. Younger Khans began to ask not only what had happened, but why it had unfolded as it did. They listened to elders recount the confusion, the fear, the chaos. They heard about the misidentifications, the assumptions made on both sides, the rapid escalation that left no space for correction. These details did not excuse the loss, but they complicated it. For many elders, this line of questioning was uncomfortable. Bitter Springs had long served as proof of the world's hostility. It justified isolation and resistance. To complicate the story felt like risking its protective certainty. If the massacre was not purely deliberate, then the boundaries built around it might be less absolute. Papa Khan resisted this reinterpretation at first. To him, the distinction between intention and outcome mattered little. The result had been the same. Children and elders had died. A refuge had been destroyed. Whether through malice or mistake, the NCR had brought devastation. That truth, he believed, did not change. Yet even Papa Khan could not deny that the world had grown more complex. The courier's accounts, along with reports from scouts and traders, painted a picture of an NCR that was not singular in motive or action. Some within its ranks questioned Bitter Springs openly. Doubt existed, even if it had not led to justice. This awareness did not bring forgiveness. Forgiveness was never the goal. What it brought was space for differentiation. The NCR was no longer perceived solely as a single, faceless force. It was understood, at least by some, as a collection of individuals operating within a flawed system. This distinction mattered, even if it did not heal wounds. For Regis, this reframing was essential. He argued that clinging to a simplified version of Bitter Springs trapped the Great Khans in perpetual reaction. The past could be honored without being allowed to dictate every future choice. Remembering did not require stagnation. Melissa echoed this sentiment from a different angle. She spoke of the emotional cost of carrying unresolved trauma. The anger, she observed, had sustained them through hardship, but it was also exhausting. It narrowed perception and dulled curiosity. The legacy of bitter springs, if left unchanged, would continue to limit their ability to adapt. These conversations were careful and often quiet. No one suggested forgetting the dead. Names were still spoken. Stories were still told. What changed was the purpose of remembrance. Instead of serving solely as warning, memory began to serve as instruction. Instruction meant asking what could be done differently. It meant acknowledging vulnerability without equating it to weakness. It meant recognizing that safety built on isolation had failed before and might fail again. For the younger generation, this shift was profound. Bitter springs had always been an inherited certainty, a fixed truth that explained the world's cruelty. To see it reframed, not erased but examined, allowed them to imagine futures that were not entirely constrained by fear. Still, resistance remained strong. Many Khans believed that any softening of perspective invited repetition of tragedy. The world had not apologized. The NCR had not changed fundamentally. Why should the Khans risk trusting a system that had already proven lethal? This question had no easy answer. The reinterpretation of Bitter Springs did not resolve division. It exposed it. It revealed that memory, while unifying, could also divide depending on how it was carried. The great Khans found themselves holding two truths at once. Bitter Springs was a massacre that had shattered lives and shaped generations. It was also an event born of fear, misjudgment, and momentum within a growing power. Both truths existed, uncomfortable and unresolved. Living with this tension required maturity. It demanded restraint in language and patience in decision-making. It required acknowledging pain without letting it consume every possibility. As these discussions unfolded, the legacy of Bitter Springs evolved. It became less of a boundary and more of a reference point, a reminder of what unchecked escalation could cost, a warning against assuming safety without vigilance, but also against assuming hostility without examination. This evolution did not erase anger. Anger remained, but it lost its monopoly on identity. Other emotions emerged alongside it: curiosity, wariness, a cautious desire for something different. Papa Khan observed this change with quiet ambivalence. He had carried Bitter Springs as a shield for so long that lowering it, even slightly, felt dangerous. Yet he could see that the shield had also become a wall, separating the great Khans from futures they might otherwise reach. The legacy of Bitter Springs was no longer singular. It had become layered, carrying grief, warning, and possibility all at once. This complexity did not weaken the great Khans. It challenged them. In accepting that challenge, they did not abandon their past. They deepened their relationship with it. Memory became less about preservation of pain and more about preservation of meaning. The wasteland beyond Red Rock Canyon remained uncertain and unforgiving. No reinterpretation could change that. But within the canyon, something shifted. The past loosened its grip, just enough to allow movement. Bitter Springs would always matter. Its scars would never fully fade. Yet for the first time, those scars were not the only thing guiding the great Khans forward. In this quiet reassessment, the groundwork was laid for decisions still to come. Decisions that would determine whether the great Khans remained defined by what had been done to them, or by what they chose to do next. With memory reframed and possibility cautiously acknowledged, the great Khans faced a narrowing set of paths. These paths were not abstract ideas or distant futures. They were immediate, tangible outcomes shaped by forces already pressing against Red Rock Canyon. Each option carried weight, and none offered certainty or safety. One path led toward cooperation with the new California Republic. This path promised stability of a kind the Khans had never truly known. It offered access to trade routes, protection from larger threats, and recognition as something other than raiders. Cooperation did not imply equality, but it did suggest survival within an expanding system. Yet, this path demanded concessions. It required trust in an institution that had brought devastation before. Even if individual intentions had varied, the system itself remained unchanged. Laws would be imposed. Movement would be restricted. Identity would be reshaped to fit legal definitions that left little room for tradition or autonomy. For many elders, this path felt like erasure through compliance. The great Khans would survive, but only as citizens stripped of their distinct history. The cost of such survival felt too high, especially to those who had lived through the consequences of misplaced trust. Another path pointed toward full alignment with Caesar's legion. This option promised immediate relevance and protection through strength. The legion did not hide its intentions. It offered purpose within a rigid hierarchy, enforcing order through absolute control. In return, it demanded loyalty without question. To some, this path felt honest. The legion did not pretend to value individuality or compromise. Its brutality was overt, its expectations clear. In a world defined by violence, this transparency appealed to those exhausted by ambiguity, but the price was unmistakable. The legion did not preserve cultures, it absorbed them, reshaping people into instruments of its will. The Great Khan's traditions, memory, and autonomy would survive only insofar as they served Caesar's narrative. The name might remain, but its meaning would be hollowed out. Younger Khans who had studied the legion's methods understood this danger. They saw in its ranks the loss of personal agency and the suppression of dissent. Survival under the legion meant obedience, not endurance. For a people whose identity rested on memory and choice, this path felt like a final surrender. The third path led away from both powers, toward exile. It offered the possibility of autonomy preserved through distance. Leaving the Mojave entirely meant avoiding immediate confrontation with either the NCR or the Legion. It meant starting again in lands not yet claimed by expanding empires. This option appealed to those who valued identity above all else. It promised preservation without submission, yet it also carried immense risk. The unknown offered no guarantees. New lands could be harsher, more dangerous, or already controlled by forces equally unforgiving. Exile also demanded sacrifice. The journey would be long and costly. Not everyone would survive it. Resources were limited. Knowledge of distant territories was incomplete, leaving meant abandoning the fragile stability Red Rock Canyon provided. For the Great Khans, exile was both familiar and frightening. Movement had defined their past, but this migration would be different. It would not be a retreat from immediate danger, but a deliberate severing from a region steeped in memory. Debate over these paths intensified. Each option threatened something essential. Cooperation risked identity. Alliance risked autonomy. Exile risked survival itself. No choice preserved everything. Each demanded loss. Papa Khan weighed these options heavily. His instinct leaned away from trust and towards strength, yet even he recognized the Legion's danger. His leadership had been shaped by loss, but he understood that clinging too tightly to caution could also destroy what he sought to protect. Regis and Melissa argued most strongly for independence. Whether through negotiated withdrawal or exile, they believed that survival without self-determination was a slow extinction. They acknowledged the risks, but they saw no future in submission to either dominant power. The younger generation listened closely. Their lives would be shaped most directly by whatever decision was made. For them, the idea of leaving held both fear and hope. Fear of the unknown. Hope for a future not defined by constant pressure. No consensus emerged quickly. The Great Khans were not a people accustomed to easy agreement. Their history had taught them to question certainty. Instead of resolution, what formed was clarity about stakes. Each path represented a different interpretation of survival. Was survival measured by continued existence, regardless of form, or did it require preservation of identity and choice, even at great risk? These questions cut to the core of who the Great Khans were becoming. As time passed, the external pressure increased. Legion scouts drew closer. NCR influence expanded. Neutrality eroded. Delay itself became a decision, one that narrowed remaining options. The Great Khan stood between past and future, holding memory in one hand and uncertainty in the other. They could no longer afford to remain suspended indefinitely. The moment of choice approached, not with clarity, but with inevitability. Whatever path they chose would define them for generations to come. It would determine whether their story continued as one of resistance, assimilation, or departure. It would decide whether the Great Khans remained a people shaped by loss, or became a people shaped by choice. The canyon remained quiet, but the silence was charged. The future pressed closer with each passing day, demanding an answer that could not be undone. The decision to leave Red Rock Canyon did not come with celebration or ceremony. It arrived quietly, carried through nods, glances, and unspoken understanding. The Great Khans had reached the limit of what the canyon could offer. Safety had become stagnation, and waiting had begun to feel more dangerous than movement. Preparation unfolded methodically. Supplies were sorted and divided with care. What could be carried was packed. What could not was left behind without sentiment. The canyon had been shelter, not home, and the Great Khans had learned long ago not to anchor themselves to stone. Routes were chosen with caution. Scouts mapped paths that avoided major roads and known patrol routes. The goal was not speed, but invisibility. Every step away from the canyon carried risk, but remaining carried certainty. The balance had shifted. For many, the act of leaving stirred conflicting emotions. Red Rock Canyon held memories of relative peace, of nights without gunfire and mornings without flight. It had given children space to grow and elders time to breathe. Leaving meant surrendering that fragile stability to uncertainty once more. Yet the canyon also held reminders of limitation. Its walls had protected, but they had also confined. Opportunities passed beyond its borders, while life inside repeated itself. The exodus was not an escape from danger alone. It was an acknowledgement that survival required movement. Papa Khan walked the canyon paths one last time before departure. He did not speak to gather attention. He moved alone, tracing familiar routes and pausing at overlooks where he had once watched for threats. The canyon had served its purpose. It had preserved the Great Khans through a critical moment. Asking more of it would only invite disappointment. When the time came, the departure was orderly. Groups moved in sequence, maintaining distance to reduce visibility. Fires were extinguished completely. Tracks were disguised where possible. The canyon fell silent behind them, empty once more, as if it had never sheltered a people at all. Children were kept close during the first days. The pace was slower than some desired, but caution guided every decision. Elders were supported, their movement prioritized despite the strain. Leaving no one behind mattered more than reaching a destination quickly. As the canyon receded into distance, memory shifted. Red Rock became a chapter rather than a present reality. Its lessons remained, but its hold loosened. The Great Khans carried what they needed forward, leaving the rest to the stone. The road ahead tested resolve immediately. Supplies dwindled faster than expected. Weather shifted unpredictably. Familiar landmarks gave way to unfamiliar terrain. Each night required reassessment. Each morning demanded renewed commitment. Despite hardship, something changed among the Great Khans during this exodus. The act of choosing departure brought clarity. Fear remained, but it no longer dominated every decision. Movement restored a sense of agency that had been absent during years of waiting. Conversations during rest periods reflected this shift. The past was still discussed, but it no longer consumed every exchange. Plans, however tentative, began to surface. Questions were asked about where they might settle, what they might become, rather than only what they must avoid. The Exodus also reshaped leadership dynamics. Papa Khan remained a central figure, but responsibility spread more evenly. Younger members took initiative, navigating unfamiliar terrain and solving problems as they arose. Authority became situational, responsive rather than fixed. Not everyone embraced the journey fully. Some struggled with doubt, questioning whether leaving had been a mistake. These concerns were not dismissed. They were acknowledged quietly, absorbed into collective resolve. The great Khans had learned that survival required listening as much as leading. Encounters with outsiders along the way were limited and cautious. Information was exchanged sparingly. Trade was minimal. The great Khans avoided drawing attention, aware that any misstep could invite pursuit or conflict. The farther they traveled, the more the weight of the Mojave lifted. The immediate pressure of Legion and NCR presence faded, replaced by the broader uncertainty of the unknown. This uncertainty was daunting, but it was also liberating. The future was no longer constrained by familiar enemies. As days turned into weeks, the Exodus became a shared narrative. It joined Vault 15, the first massacre, Bitter Springs, and Red Rock Canyon as another defining movement in the Great Khan's history. This time, however, the movement was chosen rather than forced. Children listened to these unfolding stories as they happened, not as inherited memory. They learned what it meant to leave deliberately, to accept risk in pursuit of possibility. This lesson differed fundamentally from those taught by earlier losses. The Great Khans did not know where the road would end. They carried no map promising safety or prosperity. What they carried was decision. They had chosen to step beyond the boundaries that had defined them for too long. This exodus did not erase fear or trauma. It did not guarantee survival. It did not resolve the conflicts that had shaped them. What it did was restore motion to a people who had been held in place by memory and pressure. As the land stretched ahead, open and unfamiliar, the Great Khans moved forward together. The canyon faded behind them, its walls blending into the horizon. What lay ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time in many years, uncertainty felt like a space where something new might grow. They walked on, carrying their history not as a chain, but as a guide, stepping into a future not yet defined, but finally their own. The journey beyond Red Rock Canyon unfolded without clear milestones. Days blended together, marked more by fatigue and adjustment than by distance traveled. The Great Khans moved through terrain that offered little familiarity, relying on instinct and observation rather than memory. Each step carried them farther from the pressures of the Mojave, but also farther from certainty. The land changed gradually. Stone gave way to wide stretches of desert broken by sparse vegetation and long-abandoned structures. Old highways appeared and disappeared beneath drifting sand. Ruins offered shelter at times, but they were approached cautiously. The past had taught the Khans that intact walls often hid unseen dangers. Movement demanded discipline. Scouts rotated frequently, their senses strained by unfamiliar patterns. Sounds carried differently in open spaces, and the horizon offered little concealment. Nights were colder, quieter, and more exposed. Fires were kept minimal, their light carefully controlled. Rest was shallow, interrupted by the need for constant awareness. Loss did not cease during the journey. Illness claimed some who could not endure the pace. Injuries worsened without proper care. Decisions had to be made quickly and without sentiment. When someone could no longer continue, the group slowed as much as it could. But the road allowed little mercy. These moments echoed earlier losses, but they were faced with steadier resolve. Despite hardship, the journey fostered resilience. Shared labor strengthened bonds. Tasks were distributed naturally, based on ability rather than status. Younger members learned quickly, adapting to the demands of travel with surprising endurance. Elders offered guidance where they could, their experience shaping decisions even when their bodies faltered. Stories told along the road shifted in tone. They were less about warning and more about continuity. Past migrations were recalled not as failures, but as proof that movement had sustained them before. The exodus from the Mojave began to feel like part of a longer pattern rather than a final gamble. Encounters with others were rare but significant. Isolated travelers crossed their path occasionally, drawn by curiosity or desperation. These meetings were brief and guarded. Information was exchanged cautiously, each side measuring the other for threat or opportunity. The great Khans did not linger. Movement remained their priority. As they traveled farther north and east, the influence of the NCR and the Legion diminished. Their symbols no longer appeared on distant patrols or weathered signs. This absence brought relief, but it also removed a familiar framework. Without known adversaries, the future felt unstructured and undefined. The great Khans adapted to this uncertainty by observing local patterns. They noted wildlife behavior, weather cycles, and the remnants of pre-war infrastructure. Knowledge became currency again, replacing the reactive strategies developed under constant pressure. This shift required patience and attention, skills dulled by years of survival under threat. Chem supplies dwindled along the way, forcing difficult adjustments. Without easy access to trade networks, dependency became unsustainable. Withdrawal was harsh, marked by tension and exhaustion. Yet, as days passed, clarity returned slowly, focus sharpened, decisions became more deliberate. The cost was high, but the change altered internal dynamics profoundly. Leadership during the journey remained fluid. Papa Khan's presence continued to provide reassurance, but authority increasingly rested on collective judgment. Decisions were discussed openly when time allowed, shaped by immediate conditions rather than fixed doctrine. This flexibility allowed the great Khans to respond to challenges without fracturing. Children along the journey grew quieter and more observant. The road demanded maturity, and they adapted quickly. They learned to read the land, to recognize danger without panic. Their understanding of survival was shaped not by inherited fear, but by direct experience. This difference mattered. As weeks turned into months, the idea of return faded. The Mojave became a memory rather than a destination. What remained was forward movement, measured in small successes rather than long-term plans. Each safe night, each full day without loss, became its own achievement. The great Khans began to imagine settlement again, cautiously, not as immediate goal, but as distant possibility. Conversations touched on what kind of place might offer balance between safety and freedom. No conclusions were reached, but the questions themselves marked change. The journey reshaped identity. The Khans were no longer defined solely by what they opposed. They were defined by endurance, chosen rather than imposed. Movement became expression of agency rather than reaction to threat. Still, uncertainty remained constant. New lands carried unknown dangers. Other powers might emerge beyond the horizon. The great Khans did not assume safety simply because familiar enemies were gone. Vigilance remained ingrained. As the terrain gradually softened, offering more water and shelter, the pace slowed. Scouts reported signs of habitable regions ahead. The possibility of rest, however temporary, drew closer. Anticipation mixed with caution. Past experience warned against settling too quickly. The journey north and east did not resolve the great Khan's struggles. It transformed them. It stripped away some of the weight of old conflicts while introducing new challenges that demanded adaptation rather than resistance. Through this migration, the great Khans rediscovered something they had nearly lost: the ability to change without being erased. The road had taken much from them, but it had also given them distance from histories that once felt inescapable. As they continued onward, the great Khans carried their past with them, but it no longer filled the entire horizon. The future remained uncertain, but it was no longer defined solely by fear. They moved forward together, step by step, into lands that did not yet know their name. When the great Khans finally slowed their movement and allowed themselves to remain in one region longer than a passing night, the change was deliberate and restrained. They did not declare arrival. They did not mark territory. Instead, they observed, listened, and waited. The land they had entered was quieter, less shaped by marching armies or expanding borders. It offered no guarantees, but it offered space. This space allowed reflection. The constant urgency of flight eased, replaced by cautious assessment. Water sources were tested over time rather than claimed immediately. Shelter was improved gradually, without permanence. The great Khans resisted the urge to rebuild too quickly, aware that familiarity could invite complacency. In these early weeks, survival took on a different texture. Daily life still required vigilance, but it no longer revolved around imminent threat. This shift altered behavior subtly. Weapons remained close, but they were no longer always in hand. Conversations lingered longer. Silence became less tense. Reinvention began quietly. It was not framed as abandoning the past, but as adjusting to the present. The great Khans had carried their identity through displacement and loss. Now they faced the challenge of living without constant opposition. This required redefining purpose beyond resistance. Trade emerged cautiously as an option. Small exchanges with nearby groups tested boundaries without commitment. These interactions were limited and measured. Trust was built slowly, if at all. The great Khans offered goods and labor rather than force, assessing reactions carefully. This shift did not erase suspicion. Every interaction was evaluated for risk. Yet the absence of immediate hostility allowed new patterns to form. Conflict was no longer assumed. It became one possibility among many. The reduction in chem reliance became more apparent during this period. Without established networks to sustain trade, dependence diminished out of necessity. The transition was uneven and difficult, marked by physical strain and emotional volatility. Over time, clarity returned, energy stabilized, focus sharpened. This change affected internal dynamics profoundly. Decision-making became more deliberate. Emotional responses softened. Disputes still occurred, but they were resolved without escalation more often than before. The great Khans began to experience a different rhythm of life, one less dominated by extremes. Children adapted quickly. Without constant movement, they explored their surroundings, learning patterns of land and weather. Their understanding of survival expanded beyond avoidance and vigilance. Curiosity resurfaced, cautious but persistent. Elders watched these changes with mixed emotion. They were relieved to see stability return, even temporarily. At the same time, they remained alert to the dangers of forgetting. Memory was still honored, stories were still told, but they were no longer the only lens through which the world was viewed. Leadership during this period became more distributed. Papa Khan remained respected, but his role shifted. He no longer needed to guard against immediate annihilation. His presence became more symbolic, a reminder of endurance rather than a constant source of direction. Younger leaders stepped forward naturally, addressing practical concerns and guiding adaptation. Their authority was not contested. It was recognized as necessary for a world that demanded flexibility rather than resistance alone. The great Khans began to consider sustainability. Hunting and gathering practices were adjusted to avoid depletion. Shelter construction balanced durability with mobility. These considerations reflected a desire to remain without inviting disaster. Reinvention also meant confronting reputation. The great Khans were known elsewhere as raiders, defined by past violence. In this new region, they were unknown. This anonymity allowed choice. They could decide how to present themselves, how to engage, how to be remembered. This opportunity carried weight. it demanded restraint and intention. The great Khans were aware that one violent act could re-establish old patterns. They weighed actions carefully, understanding that identity was shaped not by history alone, but by behavior. Some struggled with this restraint. Violence had once provided clarity and purpose. Without it, uncertainty surfaced. These struggles were acknowledged, not suppressed. The great Khans had learned that ignoring internal tension invited fracture. Over time, the idea of being more than raiders took root, not as aspiration, but as observation. Life without constant conflict revealed capacities previously dormant. Skills emerged that had little use during flight: crafting, repair, negotiation. These abilities reshaped self-perception. This reinvention did not romanticize the future. The great Khans understood that danger remained. New powers could rise, old enemies could reappear. Safety was conditional and temporary. Yet, this awareness no longer paralyzed them. They began to understand survival as balance rather than opposition. Balance between memory and adaptation, between vigilance and openness, between identity and change. The land they occupied did not belong to them, and they did not claim it. They existed within it, attentive and respectful. This approach reduced conflict and preserved mobility. It reflected lessons learned through generations of loss. As weeks turned into months, the great Khans found themselves in unfamiliar territory, not geographically, but emotionally. They were not waiting for the next catastrophe, they were living. This state was fragile and untested. It required effort to maintain, but it marked a profound shift. The great Khans were no longer defined solely by where they had been pushed. They were defining themselves by how they chose to exist. Reinvention did not erase the past, it integrated it. The massacres, the migrations, the losses remained part of their story, but they were no longer the only chapters that mattered. In this new phase, the great Khans began to understand that survival could include growth without betrayal of memory, that endurance could coexist with change. They did not know how long this balance would last. They did not assume permanence. They moved forward carefully, aware that the world remained unpredictable. Yet for the first time in generations, the great Khans were not merely enduring history. They were participating in its unfolding. This reinvention was quiet and incomplete, but it was real. It did not announce itself with banners or names. It lived in daily choices, in restraint, in observation, in the slow rebuilding of trust with the world beyond themselves. The great Khans continued on, no longer only a people shaped by what had been done to them, but by what they were choosing to become. For much of their history, chems had been woven into the fabric of the great Khan's survival. They dulled pain, sharpened aggression, and offered escape from memories that refused to fade. They were traded when nothing else held value, consumed when grief pressed too heavily, and relied upon when endurance alone was not enough. In the chaos of earlier years, this reliance had felt unavoidable. As the great Khans settled into a quieter rhythm beyond the Mojave, the role of chems began to change, not through decree, but through circumstance. Distance from established trade routes disrupted supply. The networks that had once sustained easy access no longer reached them reliably. Scarcity forced reassessment. At first, the absence was destabilizing. Withdrawal brought irritability, exhaustion, and tension. Old habits resurfaced under stress. Arguments flared more quickly. Patience thinned. The great Khans had long used chems as a buffer between trauma and action. Without that buffer, emotions surfaced raw and unfiltered. Leadership did not ignore this struggle. Elders and younger leaders alike recognized the danger of allowing dependency to fracture the group. Yet they also understood that forceful prohibition would invite rebellion. Change, if it came, had to be gradual and practical. As weeks passed, something unexpected occurred. Without constant access to chems, daily life slowed. Decisions took longer, but they were clearer. Mistakes decreased. Awareness sharpened. The great Khans began to feel the difference between numbed survival and conscious endurance. This shift altered their internal economy. Where chems had once been central currency, other forms of value emerged. Skills gained importance. Repairing tools, preserving food, navigating unfamiliar land, and mediating disputes became essential contributions. Respect followed competence rather than aggression alone. Trade with outsiders adapted accordingly. Rather than offering chems as primary leverage, the great Khans exchanged labor, information, and crafted goods. These exchanges were smaller and slower, but they fostered different relationships. Trade became interaction rather than transaction. This change did not eliminate suspicion. Trust remained limited and conditional, but without the destabilizing influence of chem dependency, interactions were less volatile. The great Khans observed that fewer conflicts escalated beyond necessity. Violence, once default, became measured. The reduction in chem reliance also affected how the great Khans perceived themselves. Strength was no longer equated solely with aggression or endurance through artificial means. It became associated with clarity, restraint, and adaptability. This redefinition challenged long-held beliefs but resonated with lived experience. Some resisted this shift openly. For them, chems had been more than tools. They had been comfort, identity, and control. Letting go felt like surrendering a part of themselves. These struggles were acknowledged rather than punished. The great Khans had learned that internal conflict, if ignored, led to fragmentation. Gradually, balance emerged. Chems did not disappear entirely. They remained present, but no longer dominant. Their use became occasional rather than habitual. Trade shifted away from dependency-driven cycles towards sustainability. This economic transformation influenced long-term planning. The great Khans began to think beyond immediate survival. Resource management became intentional. Overhunting and waste were reduced. Shelter construction improved incrementally rather than through hurried improvisation. Children growing up during this period experienced a different environment than previous generations. They witnessed restraint where excess had once ruled. They learned survival skills without assuming chemical aid as necessity. Their understanding of endurance expanded beyond the patterns inherited from trauma. Elders observed these changes with cautious approval. Memory remained central, but it no longer dictated every response. The great Khans had learned, through hardship, that survival did not require constant numbing. Pain could be endured without being escaped entirely. The absence of chem-driven trade also reduced the group's visibility. Without drawing attention through known routes and transactions, the great Khans existed more quietly within their region. This anonymity provided safety and autonomy, reinforcing the value of the shift. Economic change reshaped social structure as well. Leadership was no longer reinforced by control of supply alone. Influence came from problem-solving and foresight. Authority became less centralized, more responsive to circumstance. This evolution did not erase hardship. Life remained precarious. Resources could fail. Illness and injury still posed threats. The world remained unpredictable. Yet without the constant cycle of dependency, the great Khans faced these challenges with greater cohesion. They began to understand economy not as extraction, but as balance, taking only what could be replaced, trading without exploiting vulnerability. This philosophy, aligned with lessons learned through generations of loss, now applied proactively rather than reactively. The transformation of their relationship with chems symbolized a broader change. The great Khans were redefining survival on their own terms. Disentangling necessity from habit, they were learning that endurance could be sustained through awareness rather than escape. This shift did not make them gentler or naive. Vigilance remained, strength remained valued, but violence and dependency were no longer the only languages they spoke. As time passed, the Great Khans carried this lesson forward. Economy became a reflection of identity rather than desperation. Trade became connection rather than domination. Chems, once central, became peripheral. In changing how they sustained themselves, the Great Khans altered how they understood their place in the world. They were no longer bound to cycles that mirrored their trauma. They were shaping patterns that reflected choice. This evolution was quiet and incomplete. Relapse and doubt surfaced periodically, but the direction was clear. The Great Khans were moving away from survival, defined by excess, and toward endurance, defined by balance. In doing so, they reclaimed a measure of agency that had long been surrendered to necessity. They learned that the means of survival mattered as much as survival itself. The wasteland offered no guarantees, but within this changing economy, the Great Khans found something they had not known for generations. Stability rooted not in numbness, but in clarity. As the Great Khans adjusted to a quieter, more deliberate way of living, a subtle shift occurred in how they understood themselves. For generations, they had been defined by how others named them: raiders, threats, survivors clinging to violence. These labels had shaped interactions long before words were exchanged. Now, distant from old borders and familiar enemies, the Great Khans encountered something unfamiliar, an opportunity to exist without immediate definition. This absence of external pressure allowed internal identity to surface more clearly. The Great Khans began to recognize that raiding had been a response, not a purpose. It had emerged from scarcity, fear, and repeated betrayal. Without constant provocation, its necessity diminished. What remained was a people shaped by endurance, loyalty, and shared memory. Daily life reflected this change. Tasks were divided not by dominance, but by ability. Those skilled at hunting or gathering took responsibility for sustenance. Those with knowledge of repair and construction focused on shelter and tools. Conflict resolution became more deliberate, guided by discussion rather than force. Violence, once immediate, became measured and rare. This evolution did not erase the past. Stories of raids and battles were still told, but they were framed differently. They became accounts of survival rather than achievements to be repeated. The emphasis shifted from glorification to instruction. What had worked in moments of desperation was not always appropriate for a future shaped by choice. Children raised in this environment learned different lessons than those before them. They were taught vigilance, but also patience. Strength remained valued, but it was balanced with awareness. The idea of community extended beyond immediate kin, fostering cooperation rather than competition. The Great Khans began to see themselves as a people first, rather than a tactic. Clan bonds deepened, rooted in shared responsibility rather than shared threat. Identity was no longer dependent on opposition to a specific enemy. It was defined internally, shaped by values that emerged through experience. This reframing affected how the Great Khans interacted with others. Encounters with outsiders were approached cautiously, but not automatically through aggression. Observation preceded action. Dialogue, though limited, became possible. The Great Khans discovered that restraint often preserved safety more effectively than intimidation. Reputation followed behavior. Over time, those who crossed paths with the Great Khans encountered a group that did not fit old expectations. They were alert, disciplined, and reserved. They defended themselves decisively when threatened, but they did not pursue conflict unnecessarily. This inconsistency with prior reputation created uncertainty among outsiders, which the Great Khans accepted without explanation. Internally, debates continued. Some members worried that moving away from raiding weakened the group. They feared that restraint would be mistaken for vulnerability. These concerns were acknowledged, not dismissed. The great Khans had learned that ignoring fear only allowed it to grow unchecked. Leaders addressed these doubts by emphasizing preparedness. Defense was maintained. Training continued. The difference lay in intention. Strength was preserved as protection, not as identity. This distinction mattered deeply, even if it remained invisible to those beyond the group. Memory remained central to this identity. The great Khans did not seek to forget Bitter Springs or earlier massacres. They honored them through awareness rather than fixation. The past informed caution without dictating aggression. This balance was fragile, requiring constant effort to maintain. Songs and stories evolved alongside this shift. They spoke not only of loss and survival, but of movement, adaptation, and endurance without domination. Oral history expanded to include recent journeys and choices, preserving the idea that identity was not fixed, but lived. The great Khans also reconsidered leadership itself. Authority became less hierarchical, shaped by trust and competence rather than fear or lineage. Elders retained respect, but they shared space with younger voices who had proven insight and adaptability. This exchange strengthened cohesion. As raiding receded from daily life, the great Khans confronted lingering habits shaped by years of violence. Impulses toward aggression surfaced under stress, reminding them that change was not linear. These moments were treated as reminders rather than failures. Growth, they understood, required patience. The land they occupied influenced this identity further. Living without constant pursuit allowed attention to shift outward. Seasonal patterns were observed. Resources were managed with foresight. The great Khans learned to exist within the environment rather than extracting from it relentlessly. This way of living reduced conflict not through passivity, but through integration. The great Khans became part of the land's rhythm rather than an interruption within it. This relationship fostered sustainability, reinforcing their evolving self-concept. Outsiders occasionally challenged this new identity. Some attempted to provoke conflict, testing whether the great Khans had truly changed. Responses were firm but controlled. Boundaries were enforced without escalation. These encounters reinforced internal confidence. The realization that they were no longer simply raiders carried emotional weight. It required letting go of identities forged in survival's crucible. For some, this was freeing. For others, it felt like loss. Both reactions were honored. The great Khans began to articulate who they were becoming. Not in declarations, but in practice. They were a people shaped by trauma, who chose not to reproduce it endlessly. They were survivors who understood that survival could mean continuity without cruelty. This identity was neither fragile nor final. It was adaptive, responsive to circumstance. The great Khans remained wary of idealism. They did not assume the world would reward restraint. They prepared for conflict, even as they avoided it. In redefining themselves, the great Khans did not seek redemption or recognition. They sought balance. They understood that their past would always influence perception, but perception did not have to dictate reality. This shift marked a profound moment in their long history. For the first time, the great Khans were not defined primarily by what they took or who they fought. They were defined by how they lived together. They were no longer a raider band clinging to survival. They were a people choosing endurance shaped by intention. Their story continued, not as a reaction to loss, but as an expression of resilience. In this transformation, the great Khans carried forward the lessons of every chapter before it. Vault 15, the massacres, the migrations, the canyon, none were forgotten. Each informed the present without imprisoning it. The wasteland remained unpredictable and often hostile. Danger still existed beyond the horizon. Yet within their evolving identity, the great Khans found something rare, a sense of self not solely defined by violence. They remained vigilant, capable, and prepared. But they were no longer only survivors of history. They were participants in shaping it, quietly and deliberately, on their own terms. As the great Khans settled into a life no longer defined by constant flight or confrontation, their stories began to change. Oral history had always been their foundation. Without written records or fixed monuments, memory lived in voices, gestures, and repetition. Now, those stories took on new shapes, reflecting not only what had been endured, but what had been chosen. Evenings became the natural setting for remembrance. After the day's work was done and the land grew quiet, small groups gathered in loose circles. Fires were kept low. Words carried softly. Storytelling was not performance, it was continuity, passed carefully from one generation to the next. The old stories remained. Vault 15 was still spoken of, not as origin myth, but as fracture. The first massacre was remembered as a warning. Bitter Springs remained a name spoken with restraint and respect. These events were not softened or embellished. Accuracy mattered. To alter the past for comfort was seen as dangerous. Yet alongside these stories, new ones emerged. Songs were composed quietly, often without clear authorship. They told of long roads walked together, of nights spent moving under unfamiliar stars, of moments when restraint prevented bloodshed. These songs did not celebrate victory, they marked endurance and adaptation. Their rhythms were slow, their melodies subdued, designed to be remembered rather than admired. Legends began to form around individuals, but they were grounded rather than heroic. Papa Khan appeared in stories not as a conqueror, but as a witness who carried memory without surrendering to it. Regis was remembered for his patience and foresight, Melissa for her resolve and clarity. These portrayals emphasized choice over dominance. Children listened closely to these stories, absorbing lessons that differed from those of earlier generations. They learned not only when to fight, but when not to. They learned that survival could include listening, waiting, and changing course. The stories offered guidance without command. Oral history also became a tool for cohesion. Disputes were often addressed through reference to shared stories rather than direct confrontation. Elders would recall moments when impulsive action had led to loss or when restraint had preserved the group. These reminders carried weight precisely because they were familiar. The great Khans understood that memory could harden into dogma if left unchecked. To prevent this, stories were revisited and discussed rather than recited verbatim. Questions were encouraged. Younger voices were allowed to ask why certain choices had been made, and elders responded with honesty rather than authority. This openness altered how history functioned within the group. It became a living guide rather than a fixed boundary. The past informed the present, but it did not silence it. Symbols also evolved. Where once markings and attire signaled threat or dominance, they now carried subtler meaning. Items worn or carried often reflected journeys taken or lessons learned rather than victories claimed. These symbols were recognized internally, not displayed outwardly. Rituals adapted alongside stories. Remembrance of the dead remained central, but it expanded to include acknowledgement of survival and change. Names were spoken not only in mourning, but in gratitude. The act of remembering became balanced, honoring both loss and continuation. The great Khans also became aware that their story would be told by others, often inaccurately. Raiders, chem runners, remnants of violence. These external narratives persisted, shaped by distant memory and fear. The Khans did not attempt to correct them directly. Instead, they focused on preserving their own version internally. This inward focus strengthened identity. The great Khans did not need recognition to exist. Their story mattered because it was lived, not because it was acknowledged. This understanding reduced the need for validation through conflict. Legends of the past were not erased, but they were contextualized. Raids and battles were remembered as responses to specific conditions rather than inherent traits. Violence was explained, not glorified. This reframing mattered deeply for younger generations seeking to understand who they were without inheriting every wound. As oral history expanded, it began to include moments of restraint that would once have gone unremarked. A conflict avoided, a traveler allowed to pass, a trade completed without coercion. These moments were small, but their inclusion signaled a shift in values. Songs and stories also carried warnings. They spoke of complacency, of forgetting the world's capacity for harm. Vigilance remained essential. The great Khans did not mistake change for safety. Memory ensured preparedness, even as it allowed growth. The act of storytelling itself became a shared responsibility. No single voice dominated. Elders guided, but younger members contributed, recounting recent journeys and decisions. This exchange ensured that history remained collective rather than hierarchical. Through this process, the great Khans maintained continuity across change. Identity was preserved not through rigid tradition, but through shared understanding. Stories linked past and present without freezing either. The wasteland beyond their camps remained unpredictable, and new challenges would inevitably arise. When they did, the great Khans would meet them with a foundation shaped by narrative as much as by skill. Their stories had prepared them not only to remember, but to adapt. In the quiet rhythm of spoken history, the great Khans secured something no army or settlement could offer them: a sense of self carried forward through voice and memory, resilient to loss and open to change. Their legends were not carved into stone or written into law. They lived in breath and repetition, shaped by those who listened and those who spoke. In this way, the great Khans ensured that their story would endure, flexible enough to survive the future without abandoning the past. The songs continued, low and steady, carrying lessons across generations. And in listening, the great Khans remembered not only where they had been, but who they were becoming. Beyond their own camps and stories, the great Khans existed as part of a larger narrative shaped by distance, rumor, and interpretation. In the broader history of the wasteland, they appeared at the margins of records, mentioned in reports, warnings, and passing accounts. These references were often incomplete, filtered through fear or convenience, and rarely captured the full weight of their history. In the earliest accounts, the Khans appeared as raiders born from Vault 15, defined by violence and resistance. These descriptions reflected specific moments rather than the long arc of their existence. They focused on conflict with Shady Sands and the early New California Republic, reducing complex motivations to simple hostility. In these records, the Khans were obstacles to progress, not people shaped by loss. Later accounts expanded this image without correcting it. The new Khans were remembered primarily through their clashes with NCR patrols and their role in border instability. The massacre at Bitter Springs, when mentioned at all, appeared as a regrettable incident rather than a defining trauma. Civilian loss was noted briefly, then absorbed into broader narratives of consolidation and order. In the Mojave era, the great Khans were known largely through their association with Red Rock Canyon. Outsiders spoke of chemrunners and wary warriors hidden among stone walls. The complexity of their internal debates, their shifting identity, and their struggle between memory and survival remained largely unseen. The Legion's interest in the Khans further narrowed perception. From the outside, the possibility of alliance suggested shared brutality and ideology. The reality, marked by hesitation and internal conflict, was rarely acknowledged. To distant observers, nuance was unnecessary. Within interactive histories shaped by individual choice, the great Khan's fate became uncertain and variable. Their future could end in assimilation, destruction, or departure, depending on decisions made by others passing briefly through their lives. This uncertainty reflected a deeper truth about their place in the wasteland. Their story was not fixed, it was contingent. In some accounts, the great Khans faded into obscurity after leaving the Mojave, their migration noted only as an absence. In others, they were remembered as a people who chose survival over submission, carrying their identity beyond the reach of empires. These variations revealed how easily a people's story could be shaped by perspective. What remained consistent across these accounts was the theme of endurance. Whether framed as threat or tragedy, the Great Khans persisted longer than many groups born of the same era. They adapted repeatedly, surviving forces that erased others entirely. This persistence, though rarely celebrated, marked their significance. The Great Khans also served as a mirror within the broader lore of the wasteland. Their history reflected recurring patterns of violence, expansion, and resistance. They illustrated how trauma could harden identity, how memory could both preserve and constrain, and how survival often demanded choices between equally costly paths. In contrast to factions defined by ideology or ambition, the Great Khans were defined by reaction and adaptation. They did not seek to rule or rebuild civilization on a grand scale. Their goals were narrower, shaped by immediate needs and long memory. This modest scope made them less visible, but no less important. The ambiguity surrounding their fate reinforced a central truth of the wasteland. History did not move in clean lines. It branched, diverged, and faded unpredictably. The Great Khans existed within this uncertainty, their stories shaped as much by absence as by presence. For those who encountered them briefly, the Khans were often reduced to a single impression. Raiders, traders, survivors. Few saw the full arc. Few understood the weight carried behind guarded eyes and measured responses. Lore preserved fragments, but rarely cohesion. Within their own oral history, however, these external portrayals held little authority. The Great Khans did not define themselves through how others recorded them. Their identity lived internally, maintained through memory and practice rather than recognition. This separation between internal truth and external record highlighted a recurring tension in the wasteland. Power determined which stories were written, but survival determined which stories endured. The Great Khans accepted that their narrative would never be fully captured by outsiders. In this way, their place in Fallout lore was both peripheral and essential. They did not dominate history, but they embodied its costs. They illustrated the human consequences of expansion, order, and unchecked force. Their presence reminded others that not all survivors fit neatly into emerging systems. The Great Khan's story resisted closure. It did not culminate in conquest or collapse. It continued through movement, adaptation, and quiet persistence. This open-endedness reflected the reality of many wasteland lives, shaped by forces beyond control and choices made under pressure. Their legacy within the broader lore remained uncertain by design. It invited reflection rather than resolution. It asked whether survival within rigid systems was preferable to endurance beyond them. It questioned what it meant to persist without dominating. In the absence of a definitive ending, the Great Khans remained a living question within the wasteland's history. They were not heroes or villains in the traditional sense. They were a people navigating loss, memory, and change without guarantees. This ambiguity ensured that their story remained relevant. It could be revisited, reinterpreted, and reshaped as the world around it evolved. The Great Khans did not offer simple answers. They offered continuity. In the vast, fractured history of the wasteland, their presence lingered quietly, not always seen, not always understood, but never entirely erased. And in that persistence, the Great Khans claimed their place, not through monuments or lore, but through survival carried forward into uncertain futures. Across their long history, the Great Khans came to represent more than a single tribe or lineage. Their story reflected patterns that repeated throughout the wasteland, patterns shaped by fear, loss, and the slow consequences of survival decisions made under pressure. In observing the Khans, one could see the cost of endless revenge and the weight carried by those who inherit unresolved trauma. The Khans' earliest conflicts were born of necessity rather than ideology. Violence was a response to scarcity and vulnerability. Over time, that response hardened into expectation. Each loss reinforced the belief that the world was hostile and unyielding. Revenge offered clarity when uncertainty overwhelmed. It simplified choices, reducing complex situations to a single direction. This clarity, however, came at a cost. Revenge demanded repetition. Each act justified the next, narrowing possibilities and deepening isolation. The Khans learned that survival through retaliation preserved existence, but not peace. The past remained present, shaping decisions long after the original wounds had faded from memory. Generational trauma played a central role in this cycle. Children born after the massacres did not experience them directly, yet they carried their weight through stories, behavior, and expectation. Fear became inherited, anger became familiar. Identity formed around wounds that could not heal because they were never allowed to close. The Great Khan's history illustrated how trauma, left unexamined, could become destiny. Memory, meant to protect, could also confine. Each retelling of loss reinforced boundaries around what felt possible. Change appeared dangerous because it threatened the fragile certainty trauma provided. Yet the Khans also demonstrated the possibility of breaking these cycles, however slowly and imperfectly. Their later choices revealed that survival did not require endless retaliation. Distance from old conflicts allowed perspective. Reflection softened absolutes without erasing responsibility. Breaking cycles did not mean forgetting. The Khans did not abandon memory or deny injustice. Instead, they learned to hold memory differently. Bitter springs remained a wound, but it no longer dictated every response. Loss was acknowledged without being used as perpetual justification. This shift required courage, distinct from combat. It demanded restraint in moments where violence felt familiar and comforting. It required accepting uncertainty where certainty once came from anger. The Khans learned that choosing not to strike could be as difficult as choosing to fight. Their evolution highlighted the tension between survival and growth. Survival often prioritized immediate safety, even at long-term cost. Growth required risk, patience, and vulnerability. The Great Khans moved between these priorities repeatedly, sometimes faltering, sometimes advancing. What the Great Khans represented, ultimately, was the human cost of systems that valued expansion and control over understanding. Their clashes with the NCR and flirtation with the Legion revealed how marginalized groups were often forced into impossible choices: submit, resist, or disappear. None offered dignity without sacrifice. The Khan's story also revealed how identity could be reclaimed through agency. When they chose migration over subjugation, they asserted control over their narrative. That choice did not guarantee success, but it restored authorship. Survival became something they shaped rather than endured. In this way, the Great Khans stood as a counterpoint to dominant powers. They did not seek to rule or rebuild the world. Their ambition was narrower and more personal. They sought continuity without domination. This restraint set them apart in a wasteland often defined by conquest. Their later efforts to redefine themselves beyond raiding demonstrated that identity was not fixed by origin. Behavior could change without erasing history. Strength could exist alongside compassion and caution. These realizations did not come easily, nor did they resolve all conflict, but they mattered. The Great Khan's journey underscored the importance of choice, even when options were limited. Their story showed that agency could exist within constraint, and that survival did not have to mean repetition of harm. Breaking cycles required intention as much as endurance. For the wasteland as a whole, the Khans served as reminder rather than model. They illustrated what happened when trauma went unanswered, when systems ignored the humanity of those they displaced. They also illustrated the slow, difficult work of redefining survival on one's own terms. The Khan's legacy was not clean or inspirational in conventional ways. It was marked by contradiction, loss, and unresolved questions. Yet within those imperfections lay truth. Survival after catastrophe was rarely graceful. Healing was uneven. Progress was fragile. What endured was the lesson that cycles could be challenged, even if they could not be erased entirely. The great Khans did not escape their past, but they learned to walk alongside it without letting it lead every step. In a world shaped by repeating violence, this effort mattered. It demonstrated that endurance could include reflection, that identity could expand rather than contract around pain. The Khans did not offer redemption narratives or triumph. They offered persistence with awareness. Their story asked quiet questions of anyone who encountered it. How much of the past must be carried forward? When does memory protect? And when does it imprison? What does survival mean when the world no longer resembles what was lost? The great Khans did not answer these questions definitively. They lived within them. In this way, the great Khans represented the possibility that history's weight could be borne without becoming a weapon, that trauma could inform without commanding, that survival could become something more than reaction. They were not free of conflict, they were not free of danger, but they were no longer entirely bound by the cycles that once defined them. And in a wasteland built on repetition, that quiet shift was profound. The great Khans did not leave behind monuments to mark their passage. No walls bore their names, no banners announced their arrival or departure. Their presence was measured instead by absence, by the quiet after movement, by places once occupied and then released. This pattern had followed them since the beginning, from Vault 15 to the Mojave and beyond. In the years that followed their departure into new lands, the great Khans became harder to trace. They moved without drawing attention, settling briefly, then shifting again when conditions changed. To outsiders, this seemed like disappearance. To the Khans, it was continuity. Survival had taught them that visibility invited harm, and endurance often required silence. Their identity, once defined by resistance and loss, continued to evolve. Without constant confrontation, memory softened without fading. Stories were still told, names still remembered, but the urgency that once dominated every decision eased. The past remained present, yet it no longer crowded out the future entirely. Children born during this later period grew up hearing of bitter springs and earlier massacres as history rather than immediate warning. The events shaped understanding, but they did not dictate behavior in the same way. These children learned vigilance alongside curiosity. They learned restraint alongside strength. Their worldview, while cautious, allowed for flexibility. The great Khan's wandering did not mean aimlessness. Each movement was intentional, informed by observation and experience. They chose regions that offered balance rather than dominance. Water, shelter, and distance from major powers mattered more than control or expansion. This approach limited growth but preserved autonomy. Over time, the Khan's presence left subtle impressions. Travelers spoke of a quiet group encountered briefly, disciplined and reserved, capable of force but uninterested in escalation. These accounts lacked drama, and for that reason, they spread slowly. The Khans did not become legends. They became background, woven into the wider tapestry of the wasteland. This anonymity suited them. Recognition had always carried risk. The great Khans did not seek to correct misunderstandings or rewrite how others remembered them. They understood that survival did not require validation. Their story mattered most to those who lived it. The absence of a fixed ending to their story reflected a deeper truth. In the wasteland, few stories concluded cleanly. Lives extended, adapted, and faded without resolution. The great Khans accepted this uncertainty. Their history had taught them that endurance was not about reaching an endpoint, but but about continuing despite disruption. Leadership continued to shift organically. Elders passed on memory, younger members carried forward adaptation. Authority flowed where it was needed, receding when it was not. This flexibility prevented stagnation and reduced fracture. The Great Khans remained cohesive, not through rigid structure, but through shared understanding. Conflict did not disappear entirely. The wasteland ensured that danger persisted. When threatened, the Khans responded decisively, drawing on skills honed through generations. What changed was intention. Violence was no longer default. It was reserved for moments when no alternative remained. This restraint did not make them vulnerable. It made them unpredictable. Outsiders could not easily categorize the Great Khans as raiders or settlers, threats or allies. This ambiguity created space, allowing the Khans to move through regions without provoking immediate response. As years passed, some members chose to leave the group, settling independently or joining other communities. These departures were not seen as betrayal. They were understood as part of survival's many forms. The Great Khans did not demand permanence from those who walked with them. Those who remained carried the identity forward, adapting it to changing circumstances. The name Great Khans endured, but its meaning continued to shift. It no longer referred primarily to a history of conflict. It referred to endurance shaped by choice. The wasteland itself bore witness to this quiet persistence. Regions once dominated by marching armies and rigid borders changed over time. Powers rose and fell. The Great Khans moved through these transitions without becoming entangled in their collapse. Their distance protected them from the consequences of ambitions, not their own. Memory remained central, but it was no longer heavy in the same way. It guided without constraining. The stories told by the fire reflected this balance, honoring loss without reliving it endlessly. The Great Khans had learned that survival required both remembering and letting go. In this way, their story remained unfinished by design. It resisted closure, refusing to be summarized by victory or defeat. The Great Khans did not seek to define the wasteland. They sought to exist within it without being consumed. Their journey mirrored the broader human experience after the Great War. Survival did not restore what was lost. It created something new, shaped by fragments and choices. The Great Khans embodied this process, carrying forward a culture born of fracture but sustained by adaptation. To encounter the Great Khans in these later years was to meet a people shaped by history but not imprisoned by it. Their caution was earned. Their restraint was deliberate. Their persistence was quiet, uncelebrated, and profound. They did not rebuild the old world. They did not replace it with another. They found ways to live amid its ruins without repeating every mistake carved into the land. This, more than conquest or survival alone, defined their legacy. The Great Khans continued on, moving as needed, staying when possible, adapting always. Their footsteps did not leave lasting marks, but their choices carried forward through generations. In a world obsessed with dominance and order, their story offered a different rhythm, one of movement rather than control, of memory without fixation, of survival shaped by intention rather than reaction. The wasteland stretched on, vast and indifferent. The Great Khans remained within it, neither hidden nor prominent, enduring without spectacle. Their story did not end. It simply continued, carried quietly into the uncertain future. As the wasteland settles into quiet once more, the story of the Great Khans does not resolve itself into triumph or defeat. It lingers, carried forward through memory, movement, and choice. Their path was shaped by loss and survival, but it was not confined to either. Across fractured lands and shifting powers, they endured without surrendering entirely to the forces that sought to define them. The Great Khans were never simply raiders, nor were they only victims of history. They were a people shaped by repeated fracture who learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to carry their past without being consumed by it. Their story reminds us that survival is not only about strength, but about restraint, not only about memory, but about how memory is held. In a world rebuilt through violence and order, they chose distance over domination, endurance over conquest. Their legacy does not rest in monuments or laws, but in the quiet persistence of a people who refuse to vanish. The wasteland does not remember them clearly, and perhaps that is fitting. Some stories are not meant to be loud. As you rest now, let their journey fade gently into the background, like footsteps receding into open land. The world beyond continues to change, uncertain and unyielding, but within it, the great Khans endure, not as a warning and not as a legend, but as a reminder that even in ruin, choice remains.